I invited my own flesh and blood to the most important award ceremony of my entire life. My father barely glanced at the gold foil invitation before tossing it back like trash and scoffing that nobody hands out awards to lowly teachers. My sister rolled her eyes and claimed they had much better plans, while my mother simply left my message unread. I did not scream or cry. I just sent a two-word reply saying that is fine. What they did not know was that just hours later, my father would be scrolling through his financial news feed, his face draining of all color as he froze and stammered, asking what he was looking at. My name is Maya. I am 35 years old, and for my entire life, I was the designated failure of the Caldwell family. Before I tell you how I turned their endless disrespect into the ultimate wake-up call, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own table because your family refused to give you a seat. Growing up in an affluent African-American household in Atlanta, success was not just an expectation. It was a strict requirement for basic respect. My father, Calvin, built a massive logistics empire from the ground up, and he measured human worth exclusively by profit margins and corporate titles. My mother, Beatrice, was a socialite utterly obsessed with appearances, spending her days organizing charity galas and maintaining her pristine image within her exclusive social circles. My older brother, Jamal, and my younger sister, Chloe, were the golden children. They were groomed for greatness and heavily funded every single step of the way. And then there was me. I chose education. I chose to work in inner-city public schools, dedicating my 20s to helping marginalized children learn to read and succeed against all odds. To my family, this was not a noble calling. It was a humiliating public failure that ruined their perfect picture. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Sunday evening. We were gathered around my parents' massive mahogany dining table for our mandatory family dinner. The clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine china was the only sound in the cavernous room, until I took a deep breath and reached into my purse. I pulled out a thick, beautifully crafted envelope and slid it across the polished wood toward my father. It was an invitation to the National Vanguard Innovation Awards, a highly prestigious gala honoring leaders across various industries. I had been nominated for a major recognition, and despite decades of emotional distance and coldness, a small, foolish part of my inner child still wanted my parents there to witness my moment. My father did not even bother to pick up the envelope. He simply glanced down at the embossed seal, let out a harsh, dismissive scoff, and pushed the invitation back toward the center of the table with the back of his hand. "Who hands out awards to lowly teachers?" he asked, his voice dripping with unmistakable contempt. "What is the category exactly?" "Best finger painting. Are we supposed to put on our evening wear to watch you get a plastic trophy for surviving another year in a broken public school system?" Across the table, Chloe let out a sharp, mocking snicker. As a cutthroat corporate real estate attorney, she had always viewed my career path as a pathetic joke. She picked up her crystal wine glass, taking a slow sip of her expensive Cabernet before looking at me with pure disdain. "Why would we waste our Sunday night at some boring educator banquet?" she asked casually, sliding the invitation completely off the table so it fluttered onto the floor. "You know, while you were busy wiping snotty noses and settling for a miserable paycheck, Dad was paying for my bar exam preparation and funding my networking events. Real professionals have actual business to attend to, Maya. We do not have time for participation trophies." The casual cruelty of her words was a highly familiar weapon in this house. When I graduated with my teaching degree, my father forced me to take out high-interest loans to cover my final semesters, telling me coldly that bad investments yield bad returns. Yet just weeks later, I watched him cheerfully write a massive six-figure check for Jamal to launch yet another doomed cryptocurrency startup. My brother burned through that money in less than a year, but he was still treated like a visionary pioneer, while I was treated like a charity case. My mother, Beatrice, sighed heavily and set down her linen napkin, looking at me as if my mere presence was exhausting. "Maya, please try to be considerate of our time and our reputation. It is already embarrassing enough when the ladies at my Jack and Jill Society meetings ask what my children are doing. I can brag about Chloe closing commercial real estate deals, and I can talk about Jamal being a tech entrepreneur. But what am I supposed to say about you? That you are still buying your own classroom supplies on a meager teacher salary. I cannot exactly invite my wealthy social circle to a public school auditorium. It is humiliating for the Caldwell name. Then Preston decided to chime in. Preston is Chloe's husband, a white venture capitalist who always carried himself with an insufferable arrogance, acting as though he was the absolute smartest man in any room he entered. He loved leveraging his position in the family to talk down to me, viewing my career as a prime opportunity to exercise his superiority complex. He leaned back in his chair, a smug, satisfied grin spreading across his face, and reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out his designer leather wallet, extracted a crisp $100 bill, and tossed it carelessly across the table. It landed right in front of my dinner plate. "Take it," Maya Preston said condescendingly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Buy yourself some nice chalk for your chalkboard. Treat yourself to some new grading pens. Maybe get some gold star stickers for your little kids. We really do not have time for whatever little teacher appreciation banquet you are begging us to attend." The entire table fell completely silent, waiting for my reaction. They were waiting for the usual response. In the past, I might have cried. I might have raised my voice to defend the dignity of my profession, or I might have argued passionately about the real impact I was making in my students' lives. I had spent 35 years trying to explain my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply picked up the $100 bill, folded it neatly in half, and tucked it securely into my purse. "Thank you, Preston," I said evenly, keeping my face entirely devoid of emotion. I picked up my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and offered a polite smile that purposely did not reach my eyes. "I will be sure to put this to very good use." I left the dinner shortly after that exchange, escaping the deeply toxic atmosphere of that house without looking back. Later that night, sitting in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary of my own modest apartment, I decided to give them one final, undeniable chance to show up for me. I opened our family group chat on my phone and typed a simple, straightforward message. "I have VIP tickets reserved for the Vanguard Gala this weekend. It is a major milestone for me. It would mean a lot if you came." My phone buzzed almost instantly. The reply was from Chloe. "We have better plans. Preston is taking us to a real networking event downtown where we can actually meet investors. Do not wait up for us." I sat back and watched the read receipts appear beneath my message one by one. My mother saw it. My father saw it. Neither of them bothered to type a reply. They simply left my invitation on read, treating my major life milestone with the exact same silent indifference they had shown me since childhood. I stared at the glowing screen for a long moment, fully absorbing the absolute finality of their rejection. They had made their choice loud and clear. I calmly typed my final response to the group chat. "That is fine." I tossed my phone onto the sofa and walked over to my home office desk. I opened my secure, heavily encrypted laptop and logged into a private financial portal I had been building in the shadows for the past 3 years. My family thought I was just a tired teacher struggling to get by, but they had no idea what I was doing during those long, sleepless nights. I had spent thousands of hours writing code, developing an artificial intelligence-driven literacy platform called Aura Learn, designed specifically to help struggling inner-city students read. And it had become a massive, undeniable phenomenon. My fingers danced across the keyboard, executing the final digital signatures required by the investment bank. The screen illuminated my face with a bright, undeniable glow as the final confirmation page loaded. The text on the screen was absolute and life-changing. "Acquisition of Aura. Learn LLC finalized. Transferring $250 million to primary shareholder Maya Caldwell." The conversation around the dining table shifted seamlessly as if my entire career and my invitation had just been successfully swatted away like a minor nuisance. Preston settled back into his chair looking extremely satisfied with his stunt, while my father turned his full attention to the opposite end of the table. My older brother Jamal was furiously tapping away on his phone, completely ignoring the tension in the room. Jamal was the golden son of our family, a man who had never held a traditional job in his life, but insisted on calling himself a serial entrepreneur. He slammed his phone face down on the mahogany table with a triumphant, arrogant grin. Jamal announced that his new cryptocurrency token was about to launch, and he just needed the final liquidity pool sorted out to dominate the market. My father nodded approvingly, his chest puffing out with pride as he sliced into his steak. Calvin looked directly at Jamal and told him that the wire transfer for $150,000 had cleared that morning. He proudly stated that a Caldwell man always spots market trends before the masses do, completely ignoring the fact that Jamal had never once generated a single dollar of actual profit. I looked down at my plate, remembering a conversation in my father's home office exactly 10 years ago. I had brought him my acceptance letter for my master's degree in education. I did not ask him for a handout or a free ride. I simply asked if he would co-sign my student loan because my entry-level teaching salary was not enough to cover the credit requirement. My father had looked at my paperwork with the exact same disgust he had just shown my awards invitation. He handed the papers back to me, stared me dead in the eye, and said that bad investments yield bad returns. He told me he did not throw good money into a dead-end public sector job. Yet here he was, casually dropping 6 figures on a digital coin that Jamal had dreamed up in a nightclub. I asked Jamal if this new venture was going to share office space with his last startup. I kept my voice perfectly polite, but everyone at the table knew exactly what I meant. Jamal's last company was a fitness app that never actually launched. It had drained $200,000 of my father's money before quietly folding. Jamal scoffed at my question and adjusted the collar of his designer shirt. He told me that innovation requires iteration and that people with a basic 9-to-5 mindset simply do not understand the aggressive pivot required in the tech industry. My mother chimed in immediately, rushing to cover her favorite son in a protective layer of validation. Beatrice smoothed her perfect silk blouse and looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and deep annoyance. She said, "Jamal is a visionary, Maya, just like your father. It takes a certain level of aggressive ambition to succeed in this world, something you have always lacked." She then gestured proudly toward my sister Chloe. She pointed out that Chloe made junior partner at her real estate firm because she understands the value of ruthless ambition, implying that my choice to serve marginalized youth was nothing more than a lack of personal drive and intelligence. Chloe smiled, her razor-sharp smile swirling the wine in her crystal glass. She told our mother not to be too hard on me because society always needs people willing to do the grunt work. Jamal laughed loudly at that and bragged that once his coin went public, he would upgrade from his current penthouse condo to a proper estate. My father had paid the hefty down payment on that penthouse, ensuring his son lived like royalty while I lived in a walk-up apartment on the other side of the city. I looked around the table at all of them. The sheer volume of their hypocrisy and entitlement would have suffocated me in the past. I used to fight back. I used to beg them to see my value. Today their cruelty merely fueled my focus. I politely excused myself from the table, grabbed my coat, and walked out the front door without another word. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. The cold rain beat against the windshield of my reliable 10-year-old sedan. I did not live in a luxury penthouse or a gated suburban mansion. My home was a modest one-bedroom apartment situated right on the edge of the low-income school district where I taught. The walls were thin, and the heating was entirely unpredictable. But it was mine. I had built my life entirely on my own terms. My family assumed that because I clocked out of the school building at 4 in the afternoon, my day was over. They thought I spent my evenings grading papers and crying over my bank account. They had absolutely no idea what my nights actually looked like. For the past 3 years, my small dining table had served as a secret command center. While my family attended high society galas and country club mixers, I was drinking cheap coffee at 2 in the morning, writing thousands of lines of complex code. I had watched my inner city students struggle with outdated, underfunded literacy programs that actively set them up for failure. I refused to let the system discard them, so I built something entirely new. I created AuraLearn, an artificial intelligence platform designed to seamlessly adapt to the specific learning gaps of marginalized children. I built the software line by line, tested it quietly in my own classroom, and watched my students' reading scores absolutely skyrocket. Word spread fast. Other teachers wanted it. Then other districts adopted it. Then entire states began buying licensing rights. I walked into my apartment, tossing my keys onto the kitchen counter. I pulled out my phone and opened the family group chat. A part of me, that stubborn core of familial hope that is so incredibly difficult to kill, wanted to give them one absolute final chance to show up for me. I wanted to offer them a seat at my table before everything changed forever. I typed a message saying that I had VIP tickets reserved for the Vanguard Gala this coming weekend. I explained clearly that it was a major milestone for me, and it would mean a lot to have my family in the audience. I hit send and watched the delivery notification turn into read receipts almost instantly. The response came less than a minute later. Chloe replied, setting the tone for the entire household. "We have better plans. Preston is taking us to a real networking event downtown where we can actually meet investors and people of influence. Do not wait up for us." I stared at the glowing screen. I watched the little typing indicators show that my mother and my father were active in the chat. I waited. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed. They both read Chloe's cruel dismissal and actively chose silence. My mother simply left me on read, entirely complicit in the rejection. They had drawn a hard, permanent line in the sand. They valued the illusion of wealth and status over the reality of supporting their own flesh and blood. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. The cold clarity that had settled over me at the dinner table now hardened into an unbreakable, permanent resolve. I tapped the screen and sent my final reply to the group chat. "That is fine." I turned off my phone completely and tossed it onto the sofa. I walked over to my desk, pushed aside a stack of graded history essays, and opened my secure laptop. I bypassed the standard login screens and entered a highly encrypted financial portal. My heart beat with a steady rhythmic calm as the loading wheels spun on the dark screen. I had spent the last several months in intense top-secret negotiations with one of the largest global technology conglomerates in the world. They had seen the explosive growth of AuraLearn and recognized its immense capacity to disrupt the entire educational sector. The screen finally refreshed, bathing my face in a crisp blue light. I did not scream or cheer. I just sat in the quiet of my living room, completely alone, and read the final confirmation block displayed across the center of the monitor. Acquisition of AuraLearn LLC finalized, transferring $250 million to primary shareholder Maya Caldwell. The bright blue light of my laptop screen reflected against the dark glass of my living room window, casting a pale glow over the stacks of graded history papers resting on the edge of my desk. I stared at the bold, undeniable text confirming the transaction. $250 million. I did not gasp. I did not jump out of my chair or pop a bottle of champagne to celebrate. The only sound in my cramped apartment was the low, persistent hum of my aging refrigerator and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the glass. I scrolled through the final 60-page digital dossier, my eyes deliberately scanning the heavily redacted clauses and the ironclad transfer agreements negotiated by my proxy legal team. The conglomerate buying my educational software did not care that my father thought I was an absolute failure. They cared about the proprietary revolutionary algorithm I had built from total scratch. I traced my fingers over the warm keyboard of my laptop, feeling the familiar worn-down plastic of the keys. This machine had been my only loyal companion for the past 3 years. While my sister Chloe was busy rubbing elbows at expensive oyster bars, and my brother Jamal was pitching vaporware to gullible angel investors over top-shelf bourbon. I had been living a grueling, punishing double life. Every morning at 6, I stood in front of 32 inner-city fourth graders who had been entirely written off by the public school district. I spent 60 hours a week breaking up fights in the cafeteria, buying notebooks and winter coats out of my own meager pocket, and fighting a broken administrative system that expected these kids to fail. But my real work always began at 8 at night. I would sit at this exact wobbly dining table fueled by cheap instant coffee and pure, unadulterated spite, writing thousands of lines of machine learning code. I knew the educational system was flawed, so I designed AuraLearn to adapt dynamically to the specific phonics deficits and reading comprehension gaps that traditional curriculums completely ignored. I tested the software silently on my own classroom tablets, monitoring the analytics late into the night. Within 4 months, my lowest performing students were reading 2 full grade levels above their previous benchmarks. The data was absolutely undeniable. When neighboring districts caught wind of the massive score spikes, the software spread like wildfire. I never once asked my father for seed money. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. The last time I had asked him for financial advice regarding a small $500 grant application to buy basic classroom supplies, he had laughed in my face. He told me that pouring resources into the bottom 10% of society was a terrible return on investment. I remembered his exact sneer the way he adjusted his expensive silk tie and told me that the Caldwell name belonged on skyscrapers, not on charity drives. So I bypassed him entirely. I incorporated my tech business under an anonymous limited liability company. I secured a tiny, inexpensive server space and let the product speak for itself. And it spoke loudly enough to catch the attention of a global technology titan looking to completely monopolize the digital education sector. I watched the progress bar on my screen complete its final loading sequence. A small green check mark appeared next to the routing number of my private offshore holding account. The funds had successfully cleared the international escrow. I leaned back in my unpadded wooden chair, letting the reality of the moment wash over me. $250 million. I said the words aloud to the empty room, testing how they felt on my tongue. They felt like thick, impenetrable armor. They felt like absolute freedom. There were no tears of joy. I did not feel an overwhelming surge of emotion or an urge to call a friend. I just felt a deep, chilling sense of vindication settling into my bones. For 35 years, I had been the family punching bag, the cautionary tale my mother used to scare my sister into working harder. Now, the lowly public school teacher was officially the wealthiest person in the entire Caldwell bloodline. I possessed more liquid capital than my father's entire logistics empire was worth. The profound silence of my apartment was suddenly shattered by a sharp, aggressive buzzing. It was not a text message from my mother, or a condescending email from my sister. I picked up my phone and saw a high-priority security alert flashing from my personal banking application. I frowned, tapping the notification to bypass the lock screen. It was an automated fraud and liquidity warning connected to a legacy joint account, a secondary family trust that my father had set up for tax purposes over a decade ago. He had forced me to remain on the paperwork as a minor beneficiary just to manipulate his corporate tax brackets and hide his assets, but I had completely ignored the account for years, never touching a single dime of his money. The bright red text on the screen glared back at me. It read, "Warning, critical margin call, initiated insufficient liquidity in connected accounts." I expanded the alert details, my eyes narrowing as I quickly analyzed the transaction history rolling across the screen. Someone in my family was bleeding cash at an unprecedented, catastrophic rate. There were massive, frantic transfers moving from the primary family holding accounts directly into a highly volatile offshore cryptocurrency exchange. The digital footprint had Jamal's reckless desperation written all over it, but the authorization signatures belonged entirely to my father. They were rapidly liquidating stable long-term assets to cover a massive debt that was collapsing in real time. My father was dumping hundreds of thousands of dollars into a sinking ship, desperately trying to save Jamal from his own arrogance. The numbers flashing on my screen showed a family legacy teetering on the absolute edge of total financial ruin. My father had leveraged accounts he thought were untouchable, assuming the market would bounce back before anyone noticed the missing capital. He was wrong. The market was punishing him, and the automated banking system was automatically recalling the loans. A year ago, I would have panicked. I would have called my father immediately, endured his inevitable verbal abuse for daring to question his financial genius, and tried to warn him that his golden son was actively destroying the family's entire foundation. I would have played the role of the dutiful, obedient daughter, trying to save them from their own staggering hubris. I would have begged them to stop before they lost everything. But tonight was different. Tonight I was no longer the family scapegoat. I looked at the red warning flashing on my screen, signaling the imminent destruction of Calvin Caldwell's precious empire. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I simply swiped left on the notification, clearing the red alert from my screen completely. I set the phone face down on the table, reached forward, and closed my encrypted laptop with a sharp, definitive click. I turned off the small desk lamp, plunging the apartment into comfortable darkness. Let them drown in their own arrogance for one more night. Tomorrow I had a very important award to accept. The heavy tires of the chauffeured black SUV glide to a smooth, silent halt against the wet pavement outside the grand entrance of the Ritz-Carlton. The freezing rain has just stopped, leaving the city streets slick and perfectly reflecting the blinding burst of camera flashes waiting behind the velvet ropes. The driver quickly circles around the vehicle to open my door, extending a white-gloved hand to assist me. I take a deep breath, step out into the crisp evening air, and the chaos immediately erupts. I am not wearing sensible teacher flats or a clearance rack cardigan tonight. I am draped in a custom emerald green silk gown that falls perfectly to the floor, catching the brilliant light of the flashbulbs with every single step I take. The deep emerald color is a quiet, deliberate nod to the immense wealth my family explicitly told me I would never possess. The press line is a massive wall of sound and aggressive energy. Reporters thrust their digital recorders and heavy microphones over the brass stanchions, shouting my name in a frantic, overlapping chorus. They are not asking me about my daily lesson plans or my exhausted classroom budget. They are screaming rapid-fire questions about the $250 million buyout that just sent massive shockwaves through the financial sector. They want to know exactly how an inner-city public school educator managed to build a proprietary artificial intelligence platform that just disrupted the entire global tech industry. I pause on the red carpet, offering the flashing cameras a calm, perfectly polished smile. I answer two brief questions about the future of digital literacy and the absolute necessity of investing in marginalized communities. I keep my posture flawless, projecting an aura of total control. This is the exact high-stakes corporate reality my father worshipped his entire life. This is the elite, untouchable world he repeatedly claimed I was far too soft and unambitious to ever survive in. Yet here I am, commanding the undivided attention of the national financial media while wearing a dress that costs more than his first logistics warehouse. Security firmly ushers me past the frantic press line and through the opulent hotel lobby, guiding me into the private VIP green room located just behind the main ballroom stage. The room is a sanctuary of quiet luxury, stocked with chilled champagne and crystal flutes. I sit down on a plush leather sofa, smoothing out the emerald silk of my gown, and pull my phone from my designer clutch. My screen remains completely clear of any supportive text messages or missed calls from my family. They have stubbornly maintained their punishing silence, punishing me for daring to ask them to attend an event they deemed beneath their status. Instead of a congratulatory message, a notification pops up on my screen indicating that my sister Chloe has just started a live video broadcast on her social media feed. I tap the notification, genuinely curious to see these vastly superior networking plans they chose over my awards banquet. The video stream loads, instantly revealing a drab, poorly lit hotel conference room somewhere across town. The walls are covered in cheap, peeling beige wallpaper that looks like it has not been updated since the late 90s. My mother, Beatrice, is visible in the background of the video wearing a stiff designer suit and visibly scowling at a paper plate of rubbery, unappetizing hors d'oeuvres. Preston is standing near a flimsy folding table, holding a plastic cup filled with cheap red wine. He is loudly attempting to corner two visibly exhausted men in ill-fitting suits. His usual arrogant smirk plastered across his face as he desperately tries to hand them his business card. Through the tinny compressed audio of my sister's live stream, I can clearly hear my father's booming voice. Calvin is aggressively pitching Jamal's cryptocurrency platform to anyone who makes the mistake of making eye contact with him. He is using all of his favorite corporate buzzwords, puffing out his chest and bragging loudly to these bored, low-level managers about his golden son's visionary tech empire. He tells the room that Caldwell men understand digital liquidity better than anyone else in the current market. He has absolutely no idea that his visionary son's empire completely collapsed mere hours ago. He does not know that the offshore accounts have been drained by aggressive margin calls, or that the bank is already preparing the legal paperwork to seize the very home he sleeps in. Chloe flips the camera lens back to her own face, putting on a fake glossy smile for her followers. She tells her handful of viewers that she is currently mingling with the city's true corporate elite, falsely claiming that this sad little conference room is where real generational wealth is built. The sheer pathetic irony of her statement actually makes me laugh aloud in the silent green room. I reach into my clutch and brush my fingers against the folded $100 bill Preston threw at me during Sunday dinner. They are all so desperately clinging to the fragile illusion of their supreme status, completely oblivious to the harsh reality that their entire financial foundation has already crumbled to dust beneath their expensive leather shoes. I close the social media application and slip my phone back into my bag. A production assistant knocks gently on the heavy oak door of the green room, informing me that the live broadcast is about to resume. I stand up, take a deep breath to center myself, and walk down the thick, carpeted hallway toward the main ballroom. As the massive double doors swing open, the sheer magnitude of the event takes my breath away. The room is a sprawling sea of tailored black tuxedos and glittering designer gowns. Hundreds of tables are draped in heavy black velvet and covered with massive, elaborate floral centerpieces and flickering candles. The people filling this room are the absolute titans of industry. They are billionaire venture capitalists, aggressive educational reformers, and global tech magnates. And as I walk down the center aisle, they are all turning their heads to watch me. I reach my assigned seat at the very front center table located directly beneath the brilliant stage lights. The lead investor from the conglomerate that just acquired Aura Learn immediately stands up and pulls out my chair for me. He offers a warm, incredibly genuine congratulation on the successful closure of our massive deal. He looks at me with a deep, abiding respect, explicitly acknowledging the sheer grit it took to build a digital empire from a forgotten public school classroom. It is the exact kind of professional respect I had spent 35 years begging my father to give me. But looking at the powerful executives surrounding my table, I realize I do not need my father's reluctant validation anymore. I did not wait for my family to offer me a seat at their table. I went out and bought my own. The grand chandeliers above us slowly dim, casting a dramatic, sweeping blue glow across the massive stage. The quiet hum of elite networking chatter immediately dies down as the soaring orchestral music swells through the room. The host of the Vanguard Innovation Awards steps up to the illuminated glass podium. He looks out across the massive crowd, the heavy broadcast cameras tracking his every movement to beam this event to millions of viewers across the country. He adjusts his microphone, and the entire ballroom falls into absolute, breathless silence. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the relentless pursuit of progress. The host begins, his voice echoing powerfully through the state-of-the-art speakers. We are here to honor the brilliant minds that look at broken systems and refuse to accept defeat. But one individual in this room has completely redefined what it means to disrupt an industry. Tonight, we honor a woman who did not just teach the future, she completely revolutionized it. We honor a mind that looked at children who were cast aside by society and built an algorithmic lifeline to pull them forward. Please direct your attention to the screens to welcome the Vanguard Tech Innovator of the Year and the brilliant, unstoppable architect behind this week's record-breaking $250 million acquisition. The applause began as a low, rolling rumble at the back of the massive ballroom and quickly surged into a deafening roar. I stood up from my table, the heavy emerald silk of my custom gown sweeping gracefully against the plush carpet. The lead investor from the conglomerate, who had just wired $250 million into my account, offered his hand, but I politely declined with a slight confident shake of my head. I did not need anyone to guide me. I walked down the center aisle feeling the intense, unblinking gaze of hundreds of industry titans tracking my every step. These were the venture capitalists, the billionaire hedge fund managers, and the tech magnates who dictated the global economy. They were the exact demographic my father had spent his entire life desperately trying to impress. Now they were all standing on their feet, abandoning their expensive dinners to applaud a public school teacher from the other side of the tracks. I climbed the short set of velvet-lined stairs to the stage. The heat of the theatrical spotlights washed over me, bright and undeniable. I stepped behind the sleek, illuminated glass podium and looked out over the sea of faces. The cameras flanking the stage zoomed in, capturing my image to broadcast live across the major financial and technology networks that were covering the Vanguard Gala. I took a deep, steadying breath. I did not have notes. I did not have a teleprompter or a speech prepared by a high-priced public relations firm. I had 35 years of absolute clarity. The applause slowly died down, leaving the cavernous room in a state of breathless anticipation. I leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Thank you." I began, my voice ringing out clear and perfectly steady through the state-of-the-art sound system. "I am deeply honored to accept the Vanguard Tech Innovator of the Year award." When the news of the AuraLearn acquisition broke this week, I know many people in the financial sector were completely shocked. The industry expected the next major artificial intelligence disruption to emerge from a sleek, heavily funded Silicon Valley incubator. They expected it to be built by a team of engineers, backed by millions of dollars in seed capital. Instead, it was built by a single woman at a wobbly dining table fueled by cheap coffee and an educator's salary. A soft ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the front rows. I did not smile. I kept my gaze locked on the crowd, my expression serious and unyielding. I did not build this platform to impress investors. I continued, my voice gaining a harder, sharper edge. I built it because I spent my days standing in front of 32 brilliant, capable children who were actively being failed by a system that refused to see their potential. I built it because I was tired of watching marginalized youth struggle with outdated textbooks and standardized tests that were designed to highlight their deficits rather than nurture their gifts. For years, the children in my classroom have been written off by society. They have been labeled as lost causes, dismissed as bad investments, and called lowly and hopeless by people who sit in rooms exactly like this one. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The clinking of silverware had stopped entirely. Even the waiters stood frozen at the edges of the room. I was holding a mirror up to the elite corporate worldview, dismantling the very foundation of my father's toxic philosophy on live national television. "But innovation does not care about your zip code," I said, leaning closer to the microphone, injecting every ounce of my conviction into the words. "Brilliance is not confined to gated communities or penthouse suites. The children I teach are not hopeless. They are the future of our economy, the future of our technology, and the future of our world. They simply needed a tool that adapted to their brilliant minds rather than forcing them to conform to a broken standard. AuraLearn is that tool. It is proof that when you invest in the bottom 10%, the return on investment can absolutely change the world." I looked directly into the primary broadcast camera, knowing exactly who was likely watching this feed, or who would inevitably have it sent to them before the night was over. "This award and the historic acquisition of this company is not just a personal victory," I stated, my voice echoing with cold, undeniable authority. "It is a permanent reminder to anyone who has ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told that their chosen path is a dead end. I dedicate this honor to my students, to the educators who spend their own money to keep their classrooms running, and to every single person who has ever had to build their own table because the people who should have supported them refused to offer them a seat. We are living proof that true worth is built, not inherited. Thank you. I stepped back from the podium. For one solitary second, the room remained suspended in total silence. Then the ballroom absolutely exploded. It was not polite golf clap applause. It was a visceral, thunderous eruption of noise. The entire front row of billionaire executives leapt to their feet. The standing ovation cascaded backward through the massive room until every single person in the Ritz-Carlton was standing. I offered a brief, gracious nod to the crowd, turned my back to the flashing cameras, and walked off the stage with my head held high. I did not know it yet, but in that exact moment, the internet was catching fire. As I was being escorted down the backstage corridor by a team of highly attentive event coordinators, the live feed of my speech was already being spliced, captioned, and aggressively shared across every major social media platform. Within minutes, the clip would transcend the usual niche technology circles and hit the mainstream digital consciousness. Financial commentators who usually spent their evening broadcasts analyzing dry quarterly earnings reports and stock market fluctuations were suddenly throwing away their prepared scripts. Anchors on major business networks were obsessing over the mysterious teacher turned tech mogul. They were actively debating the profound sociological impact of the Caldwell acquisition, marveling at how a public school educator had quietly outmaneuvered the most aggressive software developers in the country. The narrative was perfect. It was the ultimate underdog story wrapped in a staggering $250 million bow. The hashtag #OraLearn and my name were rapidly climbing the trending charts, dominating the global digital conversation. The event coordinators guided me into a private, heavily secured VIP suite adjacent to the main stage. The heavy soundproof door clicked shut behind me, instantly muting the roaring crowd in the ballroom. The suite was dimly lit and peacefully quiet, a stark contrast to the blinding lights and chaotic energy of the stage. I walked over to a small velvet armchair, sat down, and finally exhaled a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline that had carried me through the press line and the speech was slowly beginning to recede, leaving behind a sharp, crystal-clear sense of total victory. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen to wake it up. The lock screen was a chaotic, endless waterfall of notifications. It was a digital avalanche of alerts from news applications, social media platforms, and emails from massive publications begging for an exclusive interview. But as I swiped past the media requests and the trending alerts, a different cluster of notifications caught my eye. Earlier this evening, I had practically begged my family to acknowledge my existence. I had sent a message to our shared group chat, offering them a chance to share in my milestone, only to be met with mockery and total silence. They had confidently brushed me aside to attend a pathetic networking mixer, eager to brag about Jamal's completely fraudulent cryptocurrency empire. Now the absolute silence from my family was broken. The dam had officially spectacularly shattered. My phone vibrated violently in my hand, the screen flashing brightly in the dim light of the VIP suite. The caller ID was impossible to ignore. I looked at the log of missed calls stacking up on my screen. There were 4 missed calls from my brother Jamal. There were 9 missed calls from my sister Chloe. There were 12 missed calls from my mother. And at the very top of the screen, highlighting the sheer, unadulterated panic that was currently ripping through the Caldwell household, were 27 frantic back-to-back missed calls from my father Calvin. The automated banking alert I had ignored earlier in my apartment had clearly materialized into a full-blown financial catastrophe for them. The margin calls on Jamal's disastrous crypto venture had undoubtedly drained my father's accounts, freezing his assets and exposing his massive reckless leveraging. And right as their entire fabricated empire was collapsing around them, they had undoubtedly looked up at the television screens in whatever cheap hotel conference room they were standing in, only to watch the daughter they had designated as a permanent failure accept an award for a $250 million acquisition. My phone began to vibrate again. Calvin Caldwell's name flashed across the screen for the 28th time. The man who had refused to co-sign my student loans, who had laughed at my career choice, and who had spent his entire life tearing down my confidence, was now desperately, frantically begging for my attention. I sat in the quiet luxury of the green room, listening to the phone buzz against my palm. I did not answer it. I simply watched the screen light up in the dark room, a cold, satisfied smile slowly spreading across my face. She sat perfectly still in the velvet armchair of the VIP suite, the heavy soundproof door isolating her from the roaring gala outside. She pressed the phone to her ear and tapped the first voicemail icon. It was Chloe. Her sister's voice, usually dripping with practiced condescension, sounded high-pitched, erratic, and entirely unglued. Maya, pick up the phone right now. My firm's managing partner just forwarded me an article from the Financial Times. What is Aura Learn? Why is your picture on the front page of the digital business section? Preston says the market is going absolutely crazy over some educational algorithm. Call me back immediately. Maya deleted the message with a swift, merciless swipe of her thumb. Next was Beatrice. Her mother's voice wavered, lacking its usual country club polish. Maya, darling, your father is not well. We are at this networking event and everyone is staring at us and whispering. People are showing us their phones. Please, sweetheart, just call us back so we can understand what is happening. Maya deleted that one too. Then came Calvin's messages. There were over 24 of them clogging her inbox, but she only needed to hear the most recent one to paint a perfect mental picture of his absolute devastation. She pressed play. The audio was chaotic. In the background, she could hear the tinny, generic jazz music of the cheap downtown mixer they had chosen over her. She could hear Preston aggressively arguing with someone and Jamal frantically shouting into another phone about frozen assets and locked ledgers. Then Calvin's heavy, ragged breathing filled the speaker. Maya, he began, his voice trembling so violently it was almost unrecognizable. I just saw the alerts. I was checking the market index for Jamal's launch, and the top story, your name, your face. There was a loud shattering crash in the background of the audio, the unmistakable sound of a heavy crystal Scotch glass slipping from paralyzed fingers and exploding against a hard floor. Whoa, what is this? Maya, $250 million? Call me immediately. We have a severe liquidity crisis here. The margin calls Maya. Pick up the damn phone. We need to consolidate. We need to talk about family wealth management. Call me. She lowered the phone into her lap. The desperation in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. For 35 years, Calvin Caldwell had defined her entire human worth by her bank account. Now that she possessed more liquid capital than he had ever seen in his lifetime, he was suddenly eager to discuss family wealth management. He was drowning, pulling his golden son down with him, and desperately looking for a life raft. He thought he could simply snap his fingers, and she would fall into line, handing over her life's work to cover their staggering incompetence. She felt a profound, chilling detachment. She had warned them. She had offered them a seat at her table. They chose to spit on it. Maya stood up, smoothed the emerald silk of her custom gown, and walked out of the green room. The official Vanguard after-party was held in the Ritz-Carlton's exclusive rooftop conservatory. As she entered the glass-enclosed space, the energy in the room naturally and immediately gravitated toward her. The lead investors from the conglomerate, powerful men and women who controlled global tech markets, raised their glasses the moment she approached. The CEO of the acquiring firm, a shrewd industry veteran named Marcus, handed her a crystal flute of vintage champagne. He looked at her with genuine, unfiltered awe. That was the most electrifying speech I have ever witnessed in this industry, Marcus said, raising his glass high. You did not just accept an award tonight, Maya. You put the entire educational sector on notice. To the future. To the future, Maya echoed, her voice steady and resonant. She clinked her glass against theirs, the sharp, bright chime ringing out like a victory bell. Inside her designer clutch, her phone began to vibrate violently once again. The persistent, frantic buzzing was a physical reminder of the panic consuming her so-called family just a few miles away. She did not excuse herself to check it. She did not hide in a bathroom stall and cry over their rejection as she might have done in her 20s. Instead, she reached her hand deep into the clutch, found the small switch on the side of the device, and firmly pushed it down. The vibrating ceased instantly. The phone was dead silent. She turned her full, undivided attention back to Marcus and the investors, diving effortlessly into a complex, high-level discussion about the global rollout of Aura Learn's infrastructure. She spoke with absolute authority, breaking down user acquisition metrics and server load capacities without missing a single beat. She was entirely in her element, surrounded by peers who respected her fierce intellect and valued her vision. Tonight was her night, and she refused to let the ghosts of her past steal a single second of her triumph. Sunlight streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse suite at the Ritz-Carlton the following morning. Maya awoke slowly, surrounded by crisp, high-thread-count white linens. The contrast between this sprawling, opulent suite and her cramped, drafty apartment across town was staggering, but she felt entirely at home. She sat up, stretching her arms, and took a long moment to simply breathe in the quiet peace of the morning. There was no frantic rush to grade papers before dawn, no anxiety about paying the electric bill, and no dread of a mandatory toxic family dinner. There was only the gentle, distant hum of the city far below her balcony. She slipped out of bed, wrapped herself in a thick, plush, monogrammed robe, and walked out to the suite's private terrace. A silver room service cart had been delivered earlier by a quiet attendant, laden with fresh fruit, warm artisanal pastries, and a steaming pot of dark roast coffee. She poured herself a cup, savoring the rich, earthy aroma, and walked to the edge of the glass railing. She looked out over the sprawling metropolitan skyline. The city looked fundamentally different today. It looked like a vast landscape of endless, untouchable possibilities. She had conquered it. She had forced the world to acknowledge her worth, not by playing their ruthless, exclusionary games, but by rewriting the rules entirely. She walked back inside and sat down at the heavy oak dining table in the center of the suite. She was just taking her first sip of coffee when the sharp, piercing ring of the hotel suite's landline shattered the morning silence. It was not her cell phone. Her cell phone was still buried deep in her clutch, safely silenced and overflowing with hundreds of unread, panicked messages from her relatives. She set her porcelain coffee cup down on the saucer and stared at the glowing red light on the hotel phone. She knew exactly who it was. They had bypassed her apartment. They had likely harassed her landlord, tracked the relentless media reports, and bullied their way through the hotel's front desk staff to find her. Maya reached out and calmly picked up the heavy receiver. "Yes," she answered, her voice perfectly level. "Ms. Caldwell," the concierge said. His usually polished professional tone was tightly strained, edged with a distinct layer of stress and deep apology. "I am so terribly sorry for the intrusion this morning. However, we have a rather delicate situation in the main lobby. Your family is here. They are causing quite a scene, demanding to be led up to your penthouse immediately. The older gentleman is becoming highly agitated and threatening our front desk staff with legal action if we do not provide him with an elevator keycard. Shall I call security to have them escorted off the premises?" Maya held the receiver to her ear, listening to the faint, muffled sounds of shouting echoing through the concierge's end of the line. She could picture the scene perfectly. Her father, red-faced and furious, throwing his weight around, fully expecting the world to bow to his demands. She could picture Chloe pacing frantically in her designer heels and her mother wringing her hands in absolute distress. They were desperate. They were bleeding out financially, and they had come to demand a massive transfusion from the daughter they had completely discarded. Maya leaned back in her plush chair, staring out at the skyline. A slow, glacial smile spread across her face. The power dynamic had permanently shifted, and it was finally time to let them feel the full crushing weight of it. "No," Maya said, her voice smooth and chillingly serene. "Do not call security. Send them up." The soft, melodic chime of the private penthouse elevator echoed through the vast, sunlit suite. I remained seated at the heavy oak dining table, my hands casually wrapped around my warm porcelain coffee cup. I did not stand to greet them. I did not rush to the foyer to play the role of the gracious host. I simply watched the polished silver doors slide apart, revealing the frantic, chaotic tableau of the Caldwell family. They spilled out of the elevator cab and into my private entryway like a desperate, disorganized, invading army. The sheer contrast between their current appearance and their usual manufactured perfection was absolutely staggering. For my entire life, my family had operated on the strict principle of absolute visual superiority. Today, that facade was completely shattered. My mother Beatrice looked as though she had not slept a single minute. Her normally flawless salon-styled hair was slightly flattened on one side, and the heavy, expensive makeup she wore could not completely hide the dark, exhausted circles beneath her eyes. Chloe was actually wearing the exact same designer dress she had worn to her pathetic networking mixer the night before. The expensive fabric now wrinkled and smelling faintly of stale hotel banquet food in desperation. Preston flanked her, clutching a thick leather briefcase against his chest, like a physical shield, his knuckles white from the tight, anxious grip. And then there was my father, Calvin Caldwell, the man who demanded absolute authority and total submission in every room he entered, looked physically diminished. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy red, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. The crushing weight of Jamal's financial collapse was clearly suffocating him. Yet true to his nature, he was trying desperately to mask his massive internal panic behind a forced aggressive wall of patriarch energy. He stepped out of the elevator and immediately began scanning the opulent penthouse, his eyes darting across the vaulted ceilings, the custom artwork, and the panoramic views of the city skyline. He was sizing up the suite mentally, calculating its worth, looking at my achievements, as if they were his own personal assets waiting to be claimed. There was one glaring omission from their ranks. Jamal was nowhere to be seen. The golden son, the architect of their current financial ruin, was entirely absent from the front lines of this ambush. He was likely hiding in his father-funded penthouse, waiting for his family to extract the necessary capital from the sister he had spent his entire life mocking. Before anyone else could speak, my mother launched into her performance. She dropped her designer handbag onto a side table and practically sprinted across the marble floor of the foyer. Her face was twisted into a dramatic, overly exaggerated mask of maternal joy. Tears were already pooling in her eyes, a theatrical display of emotion that I had never once witnessed during any of my actual childhood milestones. Maya. My beautiful, brilliant baby girl. Beatrice cried out, her voice echoing shrilly against the high ceilings. She lunged forward, her arms thrown wide open, fully intending to wrap me in a suffocating, tearful embrace. She wanted to create a physical bond, a tangible display of a loving mother rushing to celebrate her triumphant daughter. It was a calculated, completely manufactured attempt to erase 35 years of absolute neglect in a single motion. I did not blink. I smoothly pushed my chair back, the heavy wooden legs scraping loudly and deliberately against the floor, and took 2 swift steps, completely out of her reach. Beatrice stumbled forward slightly as her arms closed around empty air. She froze, her hands hovering awkwardly in the space between us. The fake, joyful smile faltered on her lips, revealing the raw, panicked desperation lurking just beneath the surface. She looked at me with wide, shocked eyes, entirely unaccustomed to being physically rejected. "Do not touch me," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level and completely devoid of any emotion. The temperature in the room plummeted. Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her wrinkled dress, shooting a nervous glance at Preston. My father's face darkened, the red flush spreading all the way to the collar of his stiff dress shirt. "Maya, darling, please," Beatrice stammered awkwardly, lowering her arms and clutching her hands together in front of her chest. "We are just so overwhelmed. We saw the news broadcast this morning. We saw your incredible speech at the Vanguard Gala. We are bursting with pride. We always knew you had this kind of hidden genius inside of you. We are your family, and we are just so incredibly proud of our baby girl." The sheer, unfiltered hypocrisy of her words was genuinely astounding. This was the exact same woman who less than a week ago had sighed heavily at a family dinner and asked what she was supposed to tell her country club friends about her failure of a daughter. This was the woman who refused to reply to a single text message regarding the most important night of my entire career. I looked at her, my expression hardening into stone. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or scream or give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I simply mirrored their exact energy from the night before, weaponizing their own dismissive cruelty against them. "I thought you had better plans," I stated calmly, looking directly into my mother's eyes before shifting my gaze to my sister. Chloe swallowed hard, taking a small involuntary step backward. I continued locking eyes with each of them in turn, ensuring they felt the full crushing weight of their own actions. "You explicitly told me that you were attending a real networking event," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly serene. "You told me that real professionals have actual business to attend to. You told me not to wait up for you. So I am genuinely curious. Why are you wasting your valuable Monday morning here? Why are you standing in my hotel suite begging for the attention of a lowly teacher?" Chloe's face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson. She opened her mouth to speak, likely to offer some weak, convoluted excuse about a scheduling conflict or a misunderstanding, but the words died in her throat. The reality of their situation was far too stark to be smoothed over with typical Caldwell manipulation. They were not here to celebrate me. They were here because the automated banking alerts were flashing red on their joint trust accounts. They were here because they were currently bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover Jamal's disastrous, highly leveraged cryptocurrency margin calls, and they had just discovered that their designated family failure was sitting on $250 million in liquid cash. They needed a lifeline, and they assumed I was naive enough to throw them one. My father had clearly heard enough of the emotional pleading. He recognized that Beatrice's maternal act was failing spectacularly, so he aggressively pivoted to the only strategy he actually knew. He stepped forward, pushing past my mother and completely closing the distance between us. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest in a deliberate attempt to physically dominate the space. He slipped seamlessly into his authoritarian business dad persona, the exact same tone he used to terrify his corporate subordinates and crush his competitors. "That is enough joking around," Maya Calvin commanded, his voice booming with forced artificial authority. He waved his hand dismissively through the air, acting as though my entirely justified boundaries were nothing more than a childish temper tantrum that he was generously choosing to overlook. He looked around the penthouse again, his eyes narrowing with deep calculation. "This is no longer a game," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. $250 million is not school board funding. This is aggressive corporate warfare money. You are a public school educator. You have spent your entire adult life grading papers and dealing with children. You do not understand this kind of capital. You do not comprehend the staggering tax liabilities, the federal oversight, or the predatory market forces that are going to come after you. I stood perfectly still, watching him try to gaslight me into believing I was incapable of managing the very empire I had built with my own two hands. He was desperately trying to strip away my agency, framing his absolute greed as an act of paternal salvation. "We are here to protect you," Calvin stated, looking me dead in the eye with a chilling manufactured sincerity. "We are going to step in and handle this transition properly before you make a catastrophic mistake." He turned slightly and gestured sharply toward my brother-in-law. Preston immediately stepped forward, his chest puffed out with unearned confidence. He snapped the heavy brass locks of his leather briefcase open and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He held them out toward me, a smug, greasy smile spreading across his face. "Preston's firm is going to take over your asset management immediately," Calvin declared, leaving absolutely no room for discussion. Preston stepped past my father, his expensive Italian leather shoes sinking deep into the plush, pristine carpet of my penthouse suite. He walked with an inflated, manufactured swagger, entirely convinced of his own inherent superiority. He marched straight toward the massive, polished marble kitchenette island that separated the opulent living area from the dining space, carrying his thick leather briefcase like a weapon. He snapped the heavy brass locks open, pulled out a dense stack of freshly printed legal documents, and slapped them down onto the cool stone surface with a loud, dramatic thud. He unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket and leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the marble. He looked at me with a deeply condescending, paternalistic expression, adopting the exact tone of a weary adult forced to explain basic survival to a particularly slow child. He was putting on his best white knight performance, entirely convinced that his mere presence in my suite was an act of profound charity. "Maya, listen to me very carefully," Preston began, his voice dripping with faux concern. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing. You have just stumbled blindfolded into a financial arena that eats people alive for sport. You are a teacher. You are accustomed to managing recess schedules, buying construction paper, and dealing with juice boxes. You do not understand capital gains. You do not comprehend the staggering weight of federal and state tax liabilities, and you certainly do not understand the aggressive predatory litigation that is going to come after you the second this acquisition becomes public knowledge." Behind him, my father nodded in stern agreement, crossing his arms over his chest, as if to reinforce the physical barricade they were trying to build around me. Chloe stood nearby, clutching her designer purse, her eyes darting greedily toward the stack of paperwork on the counter. "You are amateur blood in shark-infested waters," Preston continued, raising a hand to emphasize his point. "Every vulture in the financial sector is going to smell this money. They are going to circle you, drain your accounts with frivolous lawsuits, and bleed you completely dry. My firm, however, specializes in high net worth protection. We build absolute fortresses around capital. We will handle the tax burden, we will shield you from the predators, and we will manage the aggressive growth of your portfolio." He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a heavy gold-embossed fountain pen, and slid it smoothly across the marble island. It came to a halt right at the edge of the documents. "This is a comprehensive asset management transfer," Preston said smoothly, tapping the top page with his index finger. "We take a standard, entirely reasonable management fee for our white glove services. All you have to do is sign on the dotted line on the last page, and you will never have to worry about a single decimal point again. We will take it entirely out of your hands. Let the real professionals protect you." I looked down at the documents resting on my counter. I did not need to flip through the 60 pages of dense, convoluted legal jargon to know exactly what kind of trap they had laid for me. I could read the bold header on the very first page perfectly well. It was not a standard advisory agreement or a simple wealth management contract. It was a full, legally binding, irrevocable power of attorney transfer. They were not trying to shield my money from imaginary predators. They were the predators. They were desperately trying to annex my capital, to patch the gaping, bleeding hole Jamal had just blown in their family trust. I did not pick up the gold pen. I did not even touch the stack of papers. Instead, I turned my back to Preston entirely. I walked over to the suite's built-in high-end espresso machine. I picked up a clean porcelain cup, placed it deliberately under the silver spout, and pressed the brewing button. The machine whirred to life with a low mechanical grinding noise, completely shattering the tense, expectant silence of the room. The rich, dark liquid began to pour, the bitter aroma of espresso filling the air. My father let out a sharp, furious noise of absolute disbelief. Maya Calvin barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "Turn around and look at your brother-in-law when he is speaking to you. This is exactly the kind of childish, unprofessional behavior that proves you are utterly out of your depth. You are acting like an ungrateful brat when we are trying to save you from absolute ruin." I ignored him completely. I waited until my cup was perfectly full. I reached for the sugar bowl, added a single cube, and stirred it slowly with a small silver spoon. The rhythmic clinking of the metal against the delicate porcelain echoed through the suffocating atmosphere of the penthouse. I took my time. I let them stand there sweating in their expensive clothes, forced to wait on the public school teacher they had spent 35 years actively disrespecting. When the sugar was dissolved, I turned around. I leaned my hip casually against the edge of the marble island, holding the warm cup in both hands, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The brew was bitter strong and absolutely perfect. I lowered the cup, looked Preston dead in the eye, and spoke a single unwavering word. "No." Preston blinked rapidly. The smug, confident smile on his face faltered instantly, replaced by a twitch of genuine, bewildered confusion. He looked back at Calvin for a split second, then turned back to me, chuckling nervously as if I had just told a bad joke. No, Preston repeated, shaking his head. Maya, I do not think you are comprehending the magnitude of the target currently painted on your back. You cannot handle this kind of asset management on your own. You do not have the infrastructure. I comprehend it perfectly, Preston, I replied, my voice dropping to a low freezing register that instantly silenced the entire room. I also comprehend that the predatory contract you just slapped on my counter includes a clause for total, irrevocable fiduciary control. You are not offering me a white glove advisory service. You are asking me to legally hand you the keys to my entire net worth so you can quietly siphon my capital to save Calvin from Jamal's catastrophic margin calls. The color instantly drained from my father's face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. Chloe gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth as she took a panicked step backward. They had assumed I was completely ignorant of their financial collapse. They had assumed I was an easy mark. But it was Preston who completely lost his manufactured composure. The sophisticated, polished venture capitalist mask shattered into a million jagged pieces, revealing the fragile, deeply insecure man hiding underneath. His face flushed a deep, furious crimson, the thick veins in his neck bulging aggressively against his stiff collar. He slammed both of his hands down flat on the marble island, leaning heavily over the stone to glare at me with pure, unadulterated venom. "You arrogant, ungrateful little amateur!" Preston shouted, his voice trembling with raw, explosive rage. "You think because you got lucky with some absolute fluke, glorified flashcard software, that you are suddenly a financial genius? You are nothing. You are a public school babysitter who won the tech lottery. You are a complete fraud, playing dress-up in a penthouse." He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, completely abandoning any pretense of familial affection. "You know absolutely nothing about real wealth." He spat, his saliva flying across the marble. "Without my firm's protection, without your father's guidance, you will be bled dry by the next fiscal quarter. The market is going to chew you up and spit you out. You will be entirely broke, crawling back to this family on your hands and knees, begging us for a loan just to keep a cheap roof over your head. You need my firm to survive this." I let him finish. I let his desperate, furious insults echo off the high ceilings of my suite until he ran entirely out of breath. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my software or my intelligence. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at him with profound, absolute pity. I set my coffee cup down on the saucer. It made a sharp, definitive click that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent room. I reached behind me and picked up the sleek, digital tablet resting on the back counter. I tapped the screen to wake it up, opening the live financial news feed I had been reviewing right before the concierge called me. I slid the tablet smoothly across the marble island. It glided perfectly over the polished stone, coming to a halt directly on top of his predatory 60-page contract. I looked up, meeting Preston's furious, bloodshot eyes with freezing, unwavering calm. "I definitely will not be using your firm, Preston," I said quietly. "Especially since your firm filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." The absolute suffocating vacuum of sound that follows my statement is heavy enough to shatter glass. No one moves. No one breathes. The only sound in the massive penthouse suite is the gentle, distant hum of city traffic 50 floors below, and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the diamond watch on my wrist. Preston stares down at the glowing screen of my tablet, his hands still planted firmly on the marble island. His jaw hangs slightly slack. The aggressive, furious red flush that had consumed his face only seconds prior drains away in a single terrifying instant. He is left looking sickeningly pale, his skin taking on the ashen gray tone of a man who has just watched his own execution broadcast live. Chloe is the first to break the paralysis. She steps forward, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, and peers over Preston's shoulder at the digital display. Her eyes dart frantically back and forth across the screen, desperately trying to comprehend the dense financial reporting and the glaring, undeniable headline from the global business syndicate. She looks up, her face twisted into a mask of total, unadulterated incomprehension. "Preston." Chloe whispers, her voice trembling so violently it barely registers above a breath. Preston, what is she talking about? What does this mean? Preston does not answer her. He cannot speak. He is completely frozen, staring at the screen as if it is a venomous snake preparing to strike. I do not give him a chance to formulate a lie. I do not give him the luxury of spinning this catastrophic failure into a temporary market fluctuation or a minor liquidity issue. I reach across the marble island, tap the screen of my tablet, and swipe smoothly to the secondary financial report I had pulled just moments before they barged into my home. I am not simply a teacher anymore. I am the chief executive officer of a company that requires rigorous daily market analysis, and I know exactly how to read a corporate balance sheet. I will tell you exactly what it means, Chloe, I say, my voice ringing with cold surgical precision. It means your husband is not a financial savior. It means he is a desperate cornered liability. For the past 48 hours, the global cryptocurrency market has been experiencing a historic violent correction. Jamal's entire proprietary trading platform was built on highly leveraged, entirely fictitious digital assets. When the market crashed, his margin calls triggered immediately. I looked directly at Preston, watching the sweat begin to bead along his hairline. He tries to open his mouth, perhaps to issue a denial, but his throat is completely dry. Jamal needed an immediate, massive influx of liquid capital to prevent the federal regulators from stepping in and seizing his servers. I continue speaking clearly so that every single word lands like a physical blow. Calvin's accounts were already frozen, so Jamal turned to his wealthy brother-in-law. And you, Preston, eager to play the corporate white knight and secure your permanent status as Calvin's favorite, decided to bail him out. You bypassed your firm's internal risk management protocols and funneled millions of dollars of your client's capital directly into Jamal's sinking ship. You tried to catch a falling knife, and it severed your entire firm's financial artery. Calvin takes a heavy, stumbling step forward, his hand gripping the back of a leather dining chair to physically steady himself. He looks from me to Preston, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning terror. Preston Calvin demands his authoritarian bark replaced by a breathless, desperate rasp. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not expose your firm's capital to Jamal's offshore ledgers. Preston swallows hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his stiff collar. He looks at Calvin, his eyes wide and pleading, but he cannot deny the irrefutable data glowing brightly on the tablet between us. The silence from the golden son-in-law is a deafening confirmation of total ruin. But you did not stop there, did you, Preston, I ask? Leaning slightly over the marble island, relentlessly driving the final nail into his coffin. When the institutional money ran dry and the margin calls kept coming, you panicked. You realized your firm was going to face federal insolvency, so you dipped into your own personal reserves in a desperate attempt to cover your tracks before the auditors arrived. I tapped the tablet one final time, highlighting the specific creditor schedule filed in the bankruptcy court just hours ago. You liquidated your joint checking accounts, I state, turning my gaze to my sister. You borrowed heavily against the equity of your primary residence and your summer home. And according to the secondary creditor filings detailing your firm's desperate capital injections, you entirely drained Chloe's personal, irrevocable trust fund. The penthouse falls into a state of absolute ringing silence. Chloe stands perfectly still, her eyes locked on my face. The glossy, arrogant country club persona she has spent her entire adult life cultivating melts away, leaving behind a woman who has just realized she is entirely fundamentally broke. She realizes her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, and her elite social status have all been burned to ash to fund a fraudulent digital coin. You drained my trust, Chloe asks. Her voice is no longer trembling. It is dangerously low, vibrating with a raw, explosive fury. Preston finally snaps out of his paralysis. He turns to her, his hands raised defensively in front of his chest. He begins to backpedal away from the marble island, his polished shoes scuffing awkwardly against the floor. Chloe, baby, you have to understand the market mechanics, Preston stammers, his voice pitching upward in panic. It was a temporary bridge loan. The algorithms predicted a massive rebound. I was trying to protect the family assets. I was trying to save your brother from a federal indictment. The market simply behaved irrationally. It was a black swan event. You stole my money! Chloe screams, the sound tearing through the luxurious suite with terrifying volume. The picture-perfect, deeply envied golden couple shatters completely in front of my eyes. Chloe lunges forward, shoving Preston hard in the chest with both hands. Preston stumbles backward, his leather briefcase slipping from his grasp and crashing to the floor. The thick stack of predatory wealth management contracts scatters across the pristine carpet, a pathetic, useless mess of white paper. You arrogant, stupid, worthless coward! Chloe shrieks, her face contorted with genuine rage. She hits him again, striking his shoulder. You took my grandfather's trust. You took the equity in our home. You lost everything on Jamal's imaginary internet casino. We are ruined. My friends are going to read about this in the financial papers. How could you do this to me? Chloe, please calm down. Let me call the crisis management team. Preston begs, raising his arms to shield his face as she continues to scream and push him toward the entryway. We can structure a settlement. We can leverage Calvin's remaining real estate portfolio. There is no real estate portfolio. Calvin roars, his voice suddenly joining the chaotic fray. My father looks as though he is having a physical medical emergency. His face is pale, and he is clutching the leather chair so tightly his knuckles are completely white. He glares at Preston with a hatred so profound it seems to lower the temperature of the room. I leveraged the commercial properties to back Jamal's initial coin offering. Last quarter. Calvin admits, his voice shaking with the devastating reality of his own colossal failure. Everything is tied to the exchange. If your firm went under and you pumped the family trust into that platform, then the entire foundation is gone. We have zero liquidity. We are completely exposed. Completely? Beatrice lets out a high, reedy sob, sinking onto the edge of the velvet sofa and covering her face with her hands. The pristine, untouchable Caldwell dynasty is actively burning to the ground in the middle of my living room. They are screaming at each other, turning on each other like cornered animals, completely abandoning the unified superior front they had presented for decades. They are tearing each other apart over the exact same money they had used to measure my worth my entire life. I stand behind the marble island, completely untouched by the chaos. I pick up my porcelain cup, raise it to my lips, and take another slow, perfectly calm sip of my coffee. I watch them implode, feeling absolutely no obligation to intervene, comfort, or save them. They built this house of cards entirely on their own, and now they get to live in the wreckage. Amidst the deafening shouting match between Chloe and Preston, and Calvin's panicked, heavy breathing, a sudden, violent noise echoes from the foyer. The heavy mahogany double doors of the penthouse suite do not just open. They burst inward, crashing forcefully against the wall. The shouting instantly stops. Everyone turns toward the entryway. Jamal stumbles into the penthouse. He looks absolutely destroyed. He is wearing the remnants of a custom $5,000 tuxedo. But the jacket is missing. The silk bow tie is hanging loosely around his neck, and the crisp white shirt is stained with sweat. His hair is unkempt, and his eyes are wide, bloodshot, and completely frantic. He looks like a man who has just been chased through the city by a pack of wolves. He has clearly bypassed the hotel security, likely tailgating another guest, in his absolute desperation to find his father. Jamal ignores me entirely. He ignores his crying mother, his screaming sister, and his ruined brother-in-law. He stumbles past the scattered legal documents on the floor and grabs the edge of a console table to keep himself from collapsing. He looks directly at Calvin, his chest heaving violently. Dad. Jamal pants, his voice cracking a harsh, broken sound of total surrender. Dad, the federal marshals just walked into the corporate office. They froze the accounts. The servers are locked. Everything is gone. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the sprawling penthouse is the ragged, uneven wheezing coming from Jamal's chest. He clings to the edge of the console table, his knuckles bone white, his expensive tailoring clinging to his sweat-drenched frame. The golden child, the infallible heir to the Caldwell dynasty, looks like a man who has just been dragged out of a violent shipwreck. Calvin stands frozen by the dining chairs, his aggressive posture completely dissolving. The color drains rapidly from his face, leaving a sickly, grayish pallor in its wake. He takes a slow, heavy step toward his son, his hands trembling slightly. "What are you talking about?" Calvin demands, his voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper. "Jamal, look at me. What do you mean the federal marshals are at the office? We had an aggressive quarter, yes, but we were managing the leverage. We had Preston's capital injection to bridge the liquidity gap." Jamal lets out a sharp, hysterical laugh that sounds more like a sob. He pushes himself away from the table, swaying unsteadily on his feet. "There was no bridge, Dad." Jamal chokes out frantically, dragging a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. "There was no temporary liquidity gap. The entire exchange was bleeding out for months. The staking algorithm I pitched to the institutional investors, it never actually worked. I was running a shadow ledger. I was taking new deposits to pay out the early backers who wanted to liquidate their positions. It was the only way to keep the valuation inflated." The heavy, suffocating reality of the words settles over the room like a thick layer of ash. A shadow ledger, a Ponzi scheme. The visionary tech empire that Calvin had bragged about to every venture capitalist in the city was nothing but a massive, catastrophic fraud. Preston lets out a sound that is half gasp, half groan. He stumbles backward until his shoulders hit the wall, sliding down slightly as his legs simply give out. He had bypassed his own firm's risk management protocols to funnel his client's capital into Jamal's exchange. He had drained his own home equity. He had stolen his wife's irrevocable trust. He had done it all to secure his place at the right hand of the Caldwell throne, and he had poured every single cent into a black hole. My anchor investors got spooked by the sudden market volatility on Tuesday. Jamal continues, his words spilling out in a rapid, terrified rush. They invoked their emergency withdrawal clauses. They wanted $60 million moved to cold storage immediately. I did not have it. I tried to stall them, but they triggered a third-party audit. The auditors found the holes in the ledger by Thursday afternoon. They tipped off the Securities and Exchange Commission. The feds did not just freeze the corporate accounts, Dad. They froze everything. My personal accounts, the holding companies, the offshore entities. They seized the servers. They are pulling communications. They are preparing a federal indictment for wire fraud and conspiracy. Jamal's legs finally fail him. He sinks heavily onto the velvet sofa, burying his face in his trembling hands. "I am looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary," Jamal whispers into his palms. "I owe them millions. I owe everyone millions, and the money is completely gone." Chloe stands utterly paralyzed, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stares at her brother. The glossy, arrogant woman who had sneered at my public school salary just a week ago is now confronting a future of absolute destitution. Her savings are gone, her home is heavily leveraged, her husband is facing massive civil litigation and potential criminal charges for misappropriating client funds. The generational wealth she had so proudly worn like a suit of armor has entirely vaporized. Beatrice collapses into an armchair, pressing her hands against her chest, as if she is struggling to keep her heart beating. She looks at her golden son, the boy who could never do any wrong, the boy who was always forgiven, always funded, and always praised at my direct expense. The illusion of his perfection is shattered beyond repair. I remain perfectly still behind the marble island. I do not feel a single ounce of shock. I do not feel anger or sorrow or pity. I simply watch the inevitable consequences of their relentless, unchecked greed finally crash down upon their heads. They had built an entire family dynamic on the premise that wealth equated to moral superiority, and now their total lack of morality had stripped them of their wealth. Calvin stares at his broken son for a long, agonizing minute. The reality of a federal indictment, the sheer unimaginable public humiliation of the Caldwell name being dragged through the mud, visibly wars within his mind. He cannot process failure. He is psychologically incapable of accepting defeat. And so true to the toxic mechanics of his entire life, he desperately seeks a scapegoat to bear the burden of his salvation. He slowly turns his head, tearing his gaze away from Jamal, and fixes his eyes directly on me. The transition is absolutely chilling to witness. The panicked, desperate father vanishes instantly, replaced by a man backed into a corner, ready to do whatever it takes to survive. He completely drops the manufactured paternalistic facade he had been wearing since he stepped out of the elevator. The arrogant business dad act is gone, replaced by raw, naked entitlement. He marches across the room, physically positioning himself directly between Jamal and the marble island, creating a literal protective barrier for his fraudulent son. He slams his hand down onto the counter, glaring at me with a demanding, aggressive intensity. "You are going to fix this!" Calvin orders, his voice rough and commanding. I set my porcelain coffee cup down on the saucer, maintaining unbroken eye contact. I do not speak. I simply let his sheer, staggering audacity hang in the quiet air of the penthouse. "You just closed a $250 million acquisition!" Calvin continues, his tone hardening, leaning aggressively over the marble. $250 million, Maya. That is liquid capital. You are going to contact your legal team immediately and initiate a wire transfer. We need to hire the best federal defense attorneys in the country. We need to make the institutional investors whole before the SEC finalizes the indictment. If we pay back the primary victims today, we can negotiate a civil settlement and keep your brother out of a federal penitentiary. Beatrice suddenly jolts to life, rising from her armchair and rushing to Calvin's side. She looks at me with wide, tear-streaked eyes, abandoning any pretense of maternal dignity. "Maya, please," Beatrice begs, her voice cracking with desperate manufactured emotion. "He is your brother. He made a terrible mistake, but he is just a boy. You cannot let him go to a federal prison. You have more money than you could ever possibly spend in a lifetime. You are a simple teacher, darling. You do not need all of this. Jamal needs it to survive. You have to save him." I look at the two of them standing shoulder to shoulder, actively demanding that I sacrifice the empire I built with my own blood, sweat, and tears to rescue the man who had actively mocked my poverty. They expect me to simply hand over my life's work to cover the debts of a criminal. They genuinely believe that my success exists solely to serve as a safety net for their failures. "Family protects family," Maya Calvin states, his voice ringing with absolute authoritarian finality. "That is how this works. You owe this family your loyalty." I look at Calvin Caldwell. I look at the man who had refused to attend my college graduation because I chose an education major. I look at the man who had designated me as the family scapegoat, who had actively isolated me, and who had spent 35 years trying to make me feel small. A slow, chilling sensation begins to build in my chest. It is not anger. It is pure, unadulterated amusement. I let out a laugh. It is a cold, sharp, entirely empty sound that cuts through the heavy tension of the penthouse like a scalpel. It is not a hysterical laugh, nor a joyful one. It is the laugh of a woman who has finally realized that the monsters under her bed are nothing more than pathetic shadows. Calvin flinches, genuinely taken aback by the sound. The authoritative mask slips for a fraction of a second. "Family protects family." I repeat, my voice smooth, quiet, and absolutely lethal. "That is a fascinating philosophy, Calvin. That is a truly beautiful sentiment." I reach out and pick up my digital tablet from the counter. I do not look at Preston's discarded bankruptcy filings anymore. I tap the screen, opening a new tab, loading the specific county property database I had bookmarked the night before. I turn the screen around, sliding it smoothly across the marble until it rests directly in front of my father's rigid hands. "If family protects family," I state, maintaining a freezing, unwavering gaze, "then I am highly curious about these public banking records." Beatrice stops crying, wiping her eyes frantically as she looks between me and my father. Chloe takes a hesitant step forward, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Calvin stares down at the illuminated screen of the tablet, and his breathing stops completely. Because according to these municipal filings, I say my words landing with the precision of a targeted strike, you did not just leverage your commercial real estate to fund Jamal's offshore accounts. You ran out of corporate collateral a year ago. When Jamal hit his very first set of catastrophic margin calls 12 months ago, you desperately needed to cover up his failure. So you quietly, without a single word of consultation, took out a massive predatory mezzanine loan. I shift my gaze from Calvin's horrified face directly to my mother. Beatrice looks back at me, her brow furrowed in total confusion. He leveraged your ancestral home, Beatrice restate clearly. He took out a multi-million-dollar loan against the only piece of property your grandfather left you, the estate you swore would remain in this family for generations. He forged the authorization mortgaged your legacy to the absolute hilt, and poured every single cent into Jamal's shadow ledger to keep this massive fraud alive. Beatrice lets out a sharp, breathless gasp. She turns her head slowly, looking at Calvin with an expression of pure, uncomprehending horror. Calvin cannot meet her eyes. He stares down at the marble counter, his jaw clenched, entirely trapped by his own deception. And because you spent the morning rushing over here to demand my money instead of checking your own mail, I add delivering the final devastating blow, you missed the certified letter. That ancestral home went into absolute irrevocable default yesterday afternoon. The shriek that rips from Beatrice's throat is a sound I have never heard a human being make. It is not a cry of sorrow or a mere gasp of shock. It is the visceral, tearing sound of a woman whose entire identity, history, and social standing have just been physically ripped from her body. She clutches the heavy pleated fabric of her designer dress directly over her chest, gasping for air as if all the oxygen has suddenly been sucked out of the penthouse suite. Her knees buckle and she collapses heavily back into the velvet armchair, staring at Calvin with an expression of absolute unadulterated revulsion. The ancestral home was not just a piece of real estate to my mother, it was her crown jewel. It was the sprawling historic estate that proved her blue blood lineage, the ultimate status symbol she wielded against everyone she deemed inferior, including her own daughter. She had spent decades hosting lavish charity galas on those manicured lawns, using the property to secure her position at the very pinnacle of the city's elite social hierarchy. The thought of it being seized by a commercial bank, auctioned off to cover the fraudulent debts of her son, is entirely more than her fragile reality can bear. You mortgaged my grandfather's estate, Beatrice gasps, her voice breaking into a harsh, ragged wheeze. Calvin, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not forge my signature to put a lien on the only piece of history this family has left. Calvin's face is a mask of terrified, defensive rage. He takes a step toward her, his hands raised in a pathetic attempt to placate the woman he has just utterly destroyed. Beatrice, you have to understand the market positioning. Calvin stammers, his voice dripping with the desperate, hollow cadence of a cornered salesman. It was a temporary collateral assignment. Jamal was on the verge of taking the exchange public. We were going to double our entire family net worth in a single quarter. I was going to pay the loan off quietly before you ever even noticed the paperwork. It was a calculated risk to protect our son's visionary platform. A calculated risk. Beatrice screams, lunging forward in the chair and striking his outstretched hand away with violent force. You stole my legacy to fund a digital casino. You lied to me. You forged my name. The polished, untouchable Caldwell patriarch shrinks back from his wife, entirely stripped of his authoritarian armor. Beside him, Jamal is openly weeping into his hands on the sofa, his shoulders shaking with loud, pathetic sobs. Preston remains slumped against the wall in the entryway, staring blankly at the floor as the reality of his own imminent bankruptcy washes over him. The entire room is a breathtaking museum of their collective failures. They are surrounded by the opulent luxury of my penthouse, yet they have never looked more utterly impoverished. But Calvin cannot accept defeat. His ego is a terminal illness, and his brain is desperately scrambling to find a way to shift the burden of his catastrophic failure onto someone else. His eyes dart frantically around the room before locking back onto me. The desperation in his gaze hardens, mutating rapidly back into the toxic, demanding rage that has defined our entire relationship. He completely ignores his weeping son and his hyperventilating wife. He marches back to the marble island, slamming his fist down onto the stone with enough force to rattle my coffee cup in its saucer. You are going to fix this right now, Maya, Calvin demands, his voice low and vibrating with raw, unearned entitlement. You are going to stop gloating, pick up that tablet, and transfer the funds. I look at him, my expression perfectly blank. You have $250 million sitting in a corporate account. Calvin sneers, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. You are going to call your legal team. You are going to clear the default on your mother's house today. And then you are going to wire whatever capital is required to pay off the institutional investors so your brother does not go to a federal penitentiary. You are going to do it because you are a Caldwell. You are going to do it because family protects family. I let his words hang in the air. I let the sheer staggering audacity of his demand echo off the high ceilings. He has spent 35 years telling me I am a worthless disappointment, a lowly public school teacher who lacks the ambition to survive in the real world. He has actively funded my brother's fraudulent empire while refusing to co-sign a simple loan for my education. And now, standing in the ashes of his own greed, he demands my life's work as a tribute to his failures. I let out a laugh. It is a cold, sharp, entirely empty sound that cuts through the heavy tension of the penthouse like a scalpel. It is the laugh of a woman who has finally realized that the monsters under her bed are nothing more than pathetic, incompetent shadows. Calvin flinches, genuinely taken aback by the sound. The authoritarian mask slips for a fraction of a second, revealing the terrified old man hiding beneath it. Family protects family. I repeat, my voice smooth, quiet, and absolutely lethal. That is a truly fascinating philosophy, Calvin. It is a shame you only decided to adopt it the exact moment your bank accounts ran dry. I reach out and pick up the digital tablet from the counter. I do not look at the public property filings anymore. I tap the screen, opening a highly secured, encrypted digital portfolio provided by my new corporate parent company. I slide the tablet back across the marble, stopping it precisely in front of his hands. You seem to labor under the delusion that I simply sold an algorithm and walked away with a check, I state, keeping my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. You think I am just a naive teacher sitting on a pile of cash waiting for a smart, capable man like you to tell her how to spend it. But you failed to read the details of the acquisition, Dad. I did not just sell or learn. I merged it. I am now a senior executive partner, backed by a massive, aggressive global conglomerate. And my new partners do not just build educational software. They operate a highly specialized, absolutely ruthless division dedicated exclusively to acquiring distressed assets. Jamal's head snaps up from his hands. His bloodshot, tear-filled eyes widen in sudden dawning horror as my words register in his panic-addled brain. He understands corporate acquisitions. He knows exactly what distressed assets mean in this context. When the market started turning last week, and the whispers of your massive margin calls began to circulate through the financial back channels, I did not just sit in my classroom and watch. I continue, my voice dropping to a freezing, absolute zero. I instructed my legal team to move. I watched your institutional investors panic. I watched them prepare to force Jamal into federal insolvency. I knew the bank was preparing to seize the ancestral home, and I knew exactly how heavily leveraged your entire fraudulent network truly was. Calvin stares down at the illuminated screen of the tablet. His hands begin to shake violently. He is looking at a series of highly complex, incredibly aggressive debt transfer agreements. They are fully executed, signed, and legally binding. I did not just let the bank take the collateral, I say, delivering the final devastating strike. I did not let the institutional investors carve up your shadow ledger in bankruptcy court. I utilized the massive capital leverage of my new corporate holding company to buy the paper. I bought it all. I look past Calvin, fixing my eyes directly on my brother. Jamal shrinks back against the velvet cushions, looking as though he has just been physically struck. I own the lien on the ancestral home, I state clearly, letting the absolute reality of my power wash over the room. I own the outstanding commercial debts. And I bought out every single one of the institutional investors who were preparing to send you to federal prison. I didn't just let the bank take it. I own Jamal's debt, Dad. I am his primary creditor. The silence that follows is absolute. It is the silence of total, inescapable ruin. Jamal owes millions of dollars, and he owes every single cent of it directly to me. I own his financial future. I control the leverage that determines whether he lives in a mansion or a federal holding cell. I own the roof over my mother's head. I have successfully, methodically, and entirely legally annexed the entire Caldwell empire. I have become the absolute authority they spent their entire lives pretending to be. Jamal lets out a quiet, broken whimper, burying his face back into his hands. Beatrice simply stares at me, her mouth opening and closing as she tries to process the fact that her discarded scapegoat daughter now holds the deed to her entire existence. Calvin looks as though he has stopped breathing entirely, his eyes glued to the tablet that dictates his total surrender. But amidst the wreckage of the men in the room, Chloe finally moves. She has stood silently by the entryway, watching her husband collapse into a pathetic bankrupt heap. She has watched her father's power evaporate and her brother's golden facade burn to ash. She realizes in a single terrifying instant that every single man she relied upon to fund her luxurious, arrogant lifestyle is entirely broken. They are useless to her now. Chloe has always been the ultimate ruthless survivor of the Caldwell family, a woman who understands that loyalty only extends as far as the nearest bank account. She straightens her spine, rolling her shoulders back. She steps away from Preston, looking down at him with a brief flash of absolute, unfiltered disgust, completely discarding him from her future. She walks toward the marble island, her high heels clicking sharply, deliberately against the floor. Her face is a mask of pure, vicious calculation. She reaches into her oversized designer bag, her manicured fingers gripping something heavy. She pulls out a thick, bound legal document and slams it down onto the marble counter right next to my tablet. She leans forward, her eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits as she looks at me. "You aren't walking away with this, Maya. You aren't walking away with this, Maya." Chloe's hand rests flat on the heavy leather-bound document. The gold-embossed lettering of a top-tier, utterly ruthless corporate litigation firm catches the light from the chandelier above. She looks at me not with the desperation of a ruined wife, but with the cold, calculating precision of an apex predator who has just found a breach in the fence. The glossy, panic-stricken woman from 30 seconds ago has vanished entirely. In her place stands Calvin Caldwell's true heir, a woman who understands that when you are drowning, the only way to survive is to drag someone else under the water with you. "You honestly thought I would just sit back and let you parade around in your penthouse while the rest of us burned?" Chloe sneers, her voice dropping an octave completely devoid of its usual high society lilt. "I have spent the last 3 days watching my husband's firm hemorrhage capital. I knew Preston was hiding something. I knew the money was running out. So while he was busy sweating in his office, desperately trying to cover his tracks and lie to my face, I hired my own legal counsel. I paid a specialized team of forensic litigators to tear into your pristine little tech empire. I wanted to know exactly how a glorified public school babysitter built a $250 million asset out of thin air. I do not flinch. I keep my hands resting lightly on the edge of the marble island. And what did your expensive lawyers find, Chloe? A completely clean corporate structure. Proper tax filings." Chloe laughs, a dry, scraping sound that echoes harshly against the high ceilings. "They found the origin story, Maya. The real one. Not the sanitized, inspirational corporate biography you feed to the tech blogs and the business magazines." She taps her manicured index finger aggressively against the thick stack of paper. 10 years ago, you were living in Dad's house. You were a broke, pathetic college graduate who could barely afford to feed herself, let alone launch a global software company. You needed equipment. You needed hardware to build your little flashcard program. And who provided that hardware? Calvin's head snaps up. The thick, suffocating fog of total defeat instantly vanishes from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, sudden spark of recognition. He looks at Chloe, understanding dawning across his weathered face. "Dad bought a top-of-the-line desktop computer for the family study." Chloe continues, her voice ringing with triumphant malice, her eyes locked dead onto mine. "A machine purchased with Calvin Caldwell's money, housed under Calvin Caldwell's roof. And according to your own early digital footprints, Your original server logs, and the metadata embedded in your very first beta release. You used that exact computer to write the foundational code for AuraLearn. I look at the document resting on the marble. The sheer breathtaking absurdity of the claim is almost comical. They are attempting to claim ownership of a $250 million corporate acquisition because of a $2,000 piece of outdated, discarded hardware from a decade ago. It is a standard intellectual property dispute, Chloe states, leaning heavily against the marble island, practically salivating over the legal trap she has laid. The initial intellectual property, the core algorithms that form the entire structural basis of your current platform, were generated using assets belonging to Calvin's estate. Under corporate law, any proprietary technology developed using company or estate equipment belongs to the owner of that equipment. Dad owns the genesis of your entire company. Calvin straightens his spine. The physical transformation is sickening to witness. Seconds ago, he was a broken, bankrupt old man, staring down a federal indictment for his golden son. Now he puffs out his chest, adjusting his cuffs, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Chloe. He has found his weapon. He has found a loophole to reassert his absolute dominance. She is entirely correct. Calvin booms, his voice miraculously regaining its familiar authoritarian gravel. I provided the infrastructure. I provided the roof over your head, the electricity, and the specific equipment you used to build that software. Without my financial contribution 10 years ago, AuraLearn would simply not exist. That makes me an uncompensated co-founder. That makes this family the rightful owner of a significant controlling equity stake in your current holding company. You are both delusional, I reply, my voice perfectly flat, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a panicked reaction. Any first-year law student would throw that ridiculous claim out of a courtroom. I rewrote the entire codebase from scratch 5 years ago. I secured my own independent patents. I funded my own server space. You do not own a single solitary line of my intellectual property. It does not matter if we win a trial? Maya Chloe interrupts, a vicious, triumphant smile spreading across her face. You still do not understand how real wealth operates. We do not have to win. We just have to file the suit. She slides the legal document an inch closer to me. It is not just a draft. It is a fully prepared, legally binding motion for a preliminary injunction. The moment my lawyers file this intellectual property dispute in federal court, Chloe explains, relishing the venom in every single syllable, it triggers an automatic mandatory freeze on all disputed assets. Your new corporate partners are not going to look kindly upon a massive foundational IP lawsuit surfacing days after a merger. The courts will freeze your $250 million payout. They will freeze your operating accounts. They will freeze your personal holdings until ownership is decisively proven. Preston looks up from the floor, his bloodshot eyes widening as he realizes the sheer scale of his wife's ruthless maneuver. Even Jamal stops his pathetic sobbing, wiping his nose with the back of his trembling sleeve, staring at his sister with a sickening mixture of awe and terror. Do you have any idea how long corporate IP litigation takes? Chloe asks, her voice dropping to a theatrical, mocking whisper. We can drag the discovery phase out for years. We can file endless motions, request infinite depositions, and bury your legal team in thousands of pages of fabricated technical disputes. We can tie up your money for a decade. Your new conglomerate will probably void your executive contract just to avoid the public relations nightmare. You will have absolutely no access to your precious millions. You will not be able to pay your own legal fees, let alone operate your company or enforce the debt you just bought. We will bleed you completely dry before a judge ever even hears the opening arguments. She is outlining a strategy of pure, unadulterated financial terrorism. It is the exact same predatory tactic their wealth management firms use to crush smaller, vulnerable competitors. They are weaponizing the legal system, using the sheer cost and grueling duration of the process as a bludgeon to force a surrender. They do not care about justice or intellectual property. They only care about leverage. Unless Chloe says the word, hanging heavily, toxically in the air. She reaches into her designer bag one more time and produces a single crisp sheet of paper. She places it gently on top of the massive injunction filing. Unless you sign this. I look down at the single sheet. It is a waiver of rights and a comprehensive financial settlement agreement. $30 million. Chloe states, her eyes locked onto mine, burning with greedy intensity. That is the price of family peace. You wire $30 million into Dad's accounts by the close of business today. It is a fraction of your overall payout. It is practically a rounding error for you now, but it is exactly enough to pay off Jamal's institutional debt. It is exactly enough to keep him out of a federal penitentiary, clear the default on the ancestral home, and keep Preston's firm afloat. You sign that paper, Maya, Calvin adds, stepping forward and planting his large hands aggressively on the marble. You pay the settlement and Chloe's lawyers destroy the injunction. We walk away. You keep the rest of your money, you keep your new company, and we preserve the family legacy. It is a simple business transaction. You pay for your freedom and you pay for your brother's life. I stare at the settlement agreement resting on the cool stone. $30 million. They are attempting to actively extort me for the exact amount required to clean up their catastrophic illegal mess. They want me to reward their financial crimes by handing over the wealth I earned through genuine, grueling labor. They have cornered me in my own home, threatening to annihilate my future, freeze my assets, and destroy my reputation unless I finance their survival. They are holding my life's work hostage to pay the ransom for their golden son. I do not reach for the gold pen resting near the documents. I do not touch the paper. I simply look at them, analyzing the sheer, breathtaking depth of their moral corruption. Sensing my silence, sensing the absolute freezing immovability of my posture, Beatrice finally steps out from behind her husband. She moves slowly, her expensive designer dress rustling softly against the floor. Her face is pale, streaked with ruined, expensive makeup, but her eyes are suddenly hard bright and utterly desperate. She has watched Calvin and Chloe deploy their legal and financial weapons, and now she steps in to deliver the final emotional strike. She walks right up to the marble island, placing her trembling diamond-ringed hands delicately on the stone surface. She looks at me not with the cold calculation of a lawyer, but with the deeply practiced, suffocating manipulation of a mother who knows exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage. If you don't sign it, Maya, you'll put your father and me on the street. Is that what your education taught you? To destroy the people who gave you life? The echo of my mother's voice hangs in the stagnant air of the penthouse, toxic and cloying. To destroy the people who gave you life. She stares at me with wide, brimming eyes, her hands trembling against the cool marble of the kitchen island. She is playing her ultimate card, weaponizing the very concept of motherhood to guilt me into financing a criminal enterprise. It is a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, honed over decades of looking the other way, while my father systematically broke me down. I look at Beatrice. I look past the expensive tear-streaked makeup and the trembling diamond-adorned fingers. 10 years ago, a younger, softer version of myself might have crumbled under the weight of that maternal disappointment. 10 years ago, I would have desperately scrambled to appease her to earn a fraction of the affection she so freely lavished on Jamal and Chloe. But I do not crumble. I do not yell. I do not panic. I feel an absolute crystallizing calm wash over my entire body. It is the profound tranquility of a woman who has finally realized she owes nothing to the people who spent 35 years ensuring she felt entirely worthless. I do not say a word to my mother. Instead, I simply turn my back on the entire room. I hear Chloe let out a sharp, incredulous breath behind me, clearly interpreting my silence as a retreat. I hear Calvin shift his weight, his heavy shoes scraping against the polished hardwood. They think they have won. They think the combined weight of Chloe's vicious legal threat and Beatrice's suffocating emotional blackmail has finally broken my resolve. They think I am walking away to hide, to cry, or to figure out how to wire $30 million to save their wretched, fraudulent dynasty. I walk slowly, deliberately across the expansive living area toward the far wall of the suite, where a massive custom-built bookshelf spans from the floor to the high ceiling. The room remains dead silent behind me. I reach out and press my hand against the spine of a thick leather-bound volume. The hidden locking mechanism engages with a soft mechanical click. A section of the shelving smoothly slides backward and swings open, revealing a sleek steel wall safe embedded directly into the structural concrete. I punch in the 6-digit numerical code. The heavy metal door pops open with a heavy, satisfying thud. I reach inside the dark, velvet-lined interior. I bypass the stacks of corporate dossiers, the encrypted hardware drives, and the secured banking tokens. I reach for the very back of the safe and pull out a single standard manila folder. It is not a new file. It has worn the edges slightly frayed from years of being carried from cheap apartments to rented rooms before finally finding its resting place in this penthouse. I close the safe. The bookshelf slides seamlessly back into place, concealing the vault. I turn around and walk back toward the kitchenette. My family watches my return with mounting, entirely visible confusion. Chloe's triumphant smirk wavers her eyes, tracking the worn folder in my hands. Preston is still slumped against the wall, clutching his knees, but even he looks up, sensing the atmospheric pressure in the room suddenly dropping. Jamal shrinks deeper into the velvet sofa cushions. Calvin's eyes narrow, his jaw clenching as he tries to anticipate my maneuver. I step back up to the marble island. I open the manila folder. Inside is a single multi-page legal document. The heavy premium paper has yellowed slightly with age. The blue ink of the notary stamps on the final page has faded, but the dense, aggressive legal text remains perfectly legible. I pull the document out of the folder. I do not hand it to Calvin. I do not hand it to Beatrice. I look directly at Chloe. I slide the yellowed document across the smooth stone surface, placing it deliberately perfectly over the top of her $30 million extortion settlement. It covers her pristine, freshly printed blackmail entirely. Chloe stares down at the faded paper, her brow furrowing in deep, genuine confusion. She looks from the document to my face, her predatory confidence faltering under my completely unwavering gaze. You clearly spent a small fortune hiring forensic litigators to tear into my corporate history. Chloe, I say, my voice echoing with a low, deadly resonance. You paid them to track IP addresses, server logs, and the metadata of my foundational code. They did an excellent job discovering that I wrote the original AuraLearn framework on a desktop computer in Dad's home office. But in your desperate rush to find a loophole, you made a catastrophic error. You forgot to investigate the human element. You forgot to look into the actual history of this family. I shift my gaze, locking eyes with my father. Calvin is staring at the yellowed document on the counter, his face draining of all remaining color. A sickening realization is beginning to dawn in his eyes. He recognizes the heavy stock paper. He recognizes the letterhead of his old, extremely expensive corporate law firm. Do you remember the day I moved out, Dad? I ask, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow fills every corner of the massive room. I was 22 years old. I had just told you that I was refusing your mandate to transfer to the business school. I told you I was keeping my education major because I genuinely wanted to build a career in teaching. Calvin swallows hard. He does not speak. He is entirely paralyzed. You were absolutely furious, I continue, relentlessly painting the picture of his ultimate arrogance. You told me I was a failure. You told me I was wasting my life on a pathetic, low-paying career track. But you weren't just angry, Calvin. You were terrified. You were terrified that a public school teacher's salary would not be enough to cover the massive student loans I had accumulated since you flatly refused to pay a single cent of my tuition. You were petrified that my creditors would somehow trace my debt back to your pristine, overflowing bank accounts. Beatrice lets out a soft, trembling gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She remembers that day perfectly well. She had stood in the hallway watching silently as Calvin ruthlessly discarded me. So you did what you always do? I say, my tone dripping with absolute freezing contempt. You brought in your lawyers. You drafted an ironclad, legally binding financial severance. You forced your 22-year-old daughter to sign a comprehensive emancipation document before you would even let me pack my bags. I tapped the top page of the document, resting on the marble island right over Chloe's extortion paperwork. This is a notarized, irrevocable waiver of financial association. I state clearly, ensuring every single person in the room understands the magnitude of the checkmate. You forced me to sign away any future claim to the Caldwell family trust. You forced me to waive any right to inheritance support or emergency capital. You built a massive legal firewall to protect your fortune from my teaching degree. Chloe's eyes dart frantically across the text on the yellowed paper. Her manicured finger traces the dense legal jargon, her breathing accelerating as she comprehends the catastrophic nature of the clauses her father's lawyers had drafted a decade ago. But your high-priced attorneys were thorough, Calvin. They were exceptionally, brutally thorough. I continue, leaning heavily over the marble, trapping his gaze. They didn't just want to protect you from my debts. They wanted a complete, total separation of entities. To ensure the firewall was absolute, the contract had to be reciprocal. In order to permanently sever me from your assets, you legally explicitly waived any and all rights, claims, or entitlements to my future earnings. Calvin closes his eyes, his broad shoulders sagging as the crushing weight of his own historical greed annihilates his final hope of salvation. I pull the document closer to Chloe, pointing directly to the highlighted paragraph on the third page. Read the clause, Chloe. I command, my voice cracking like a whip in the silent room. Read the specific intellectual property waiver Calvin forced me to sign before I ever wrote the first line of code on that old desktop computer. Chloe's eyes scan this text. Her face turns entirely ashen. Her lips part slightly, but no sound comes out. The vicious, triumphant apex predator is completely dead, replaced by a woman staring into an inescapable financial abyss. It explicitly states that Calvin Caldwell, his estate, and any associated business entities forever forfeit any claim of ownership, equity, or copyright over any intellectual property, physical assets, or digital creations developed by Maya Caldwell, regardless of the equipment location or resources utilized during the development phase. I recite from memory, knowing the words by heart. It is a blanket, absolute waiver of rights. You severed your claim to my future before I even had one. I pick up Chloe's $30 million settlement agreement from beneath my emancipation document. I hold it up for a second, letting the pathetic desperation of the paperwork register in the room. Then, with deliberate, slow precision, I tear the thick document perfectly in half. I drop the pieces into the stainless steel trash chute built into the kitchen island. The sound of the tearing paper is the only noise in the penthouse. It is the sound of their survival burning to ash. You cannot sue me for intellectual property, I state, looking directly at my sister's pale, horrified face. You cannot freeze my $250 million payout. You cannot drag my corporate holding company into discovery because your own father permanently signed away his legal standing 10 years ago. That computer argument is completely, utterly voided by his own ironclad legal barricade. Chloe looks from the trash chute to my face. Her jaw trembles. The massive, brutal legal trap she had tried to spring on me has just violently snapped shut on her own neck. She has absolutely nothing left to fight with. Preston's money is gone. Her trust is gone. Jamal's exchange is seized by the federal government, and the one lifeline they thought they had discovered has been completely obliterated by Calvin's historical cruelty. You should check your legal precedents, Chloe, I say softly, my voice devoid of any pity or hesitation. Dad legally disowned my financial future a decade ago. Your case is dead on arrival. I pause, letting the absolute finality of my statement settle into their bones. I look at Calvin, then at Beatrice, and finally back to Chloe, watching the realization of their complete, inescapable ruin take hold. But since you're so eager to deal with real estate law, I turn my attention away from my sister's pale, completely paralyzed face and direct my gaze back to my mother. Beatrice is still gripping the edge of the marble island, her knuckles white, her breath hitching in her chest. She had played the ultimate card of maternal manipulation, fully expecting me to fold under the crushing weight of biological obligation. She had expected the decades of deeply ingrained, suffocating guilt to finally kick in and force me into submission. You ask if my education taught me to destroy the people who gave me life. I say, my voice carrying a quiet, terrifying resonance that commands the absolute silence of the room. That is a brilliant piece of theatrical guilt, Beatrice. It truly is. But you are operating under a fundamental misconception. I did not destroy a single person in this room. Every single one of you walked into your own personal executions completely blindfolded by your own greed. Jamal built a fraudulent empire because he was too arrogant to do the actual work. Preston committed federal financial crimes because he was too desperate to buy his way into Calvin's good graces. Chloe hired corporate litigators to steal my life's work because she would rather destroy her sister than get a job. And Calvin mortgaged his entire legacy to hide the fact that the Caldwell dynasty is nothing but a hollow, rotting facade. I take a slow, deliberate step back toward the open wall safe behind me. I did not destroy you, I state clearly, reaching into the dark steel interior one final time. I simply stopped being your human shield. I simply stopped throwing my own body onto the tracks to stop the trains you deliberately derailed. I pull out a single sleek black folder. It is noticeably heavier than the others. It bears the silver embossed crest of the primary asset management division of my new corporate conglomerate. I walk back to the marble island and drop the black folder squarely in the center of the stone surface, right next to the shredded remains of Chloe's extortion settlement and the yellowed pages of my emancipation document. The heavy, definitive thud of the folder hitting the marble echoes like a judge's gavel. I look at Beatrice, whose eyes are completely fixed on the black folder. She is trembling so violently that the diamonds on her fingers are actually clicking against the countertop. You should probably check who bought the debt on Dad's foreclosed house, I say, my voice dropping to a freezing, absolute calm. Calvin lets out a sharp, ragged gasp. He stumbles forward, practically shoving Chloe out of the way to reach the marble island. His large, trembling hands snatch the black folder. He rips it open, folding the heavy cover back to expose the documents inside. His eyes dart frantically across the first page. It is the official notarized property deed to the Caldwell family estate. Pinned directly beneath it is the absolute assignment of the defaulted mortgage, fully executed and legally transferred. The silence that consumes the penthouse is absolute and suffocating. It is the sound of a total generational collapse. The sprawling, historic Georgian estate, the crown jewel of the Caldwell lineage, the pristine, untouchable fortress where my parents hosted their elite charity galas and sneered at the working class, no longer belongs to them. Calvin's hands begin to shake so violently that the heavy paper audibly rattles in his grip. He stares at the legal signatures, his brain completely unable to process the magnitude of the catastrophic failure he has engineered. I bought the bank's note this morning, I state, letting the words fall like heavy stones into the quiet room. The commercial lenders were preparing to seize the property at 9 o'clock. They were going to padlock the gates and auction the estate to the highest bidder to cover your fraudulent mezzanine loan. My holding company intervened. We purchased the distressed debt in its entirety. I lean slightly forward, resting my hands on the cool marble, ensuring my eyes are locked dead onto my father's horrified, ashen face. Which means I own the house you're standing in, the house you live in, and the debt you owe, I declare, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. I am your landlord, Calvin. I am the sole legal proprietor of the Caldwell legacy. Beatrice lets out a high, thin wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation. Her knees completely give out. She collapses heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, her designer dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She buries her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The sprawling manicured lawns, the crystal chandeliers, the exclusive neighborhood association, all of it is gone. She is a woman who has defined her entire existence by her address, and now she is officially homeless. Jamal remains slumped on the velvet sofa, his eyes entirely glazed over. His brain has simply shut down completely, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of the ruin his digital casino has unleashed upon his family. He stares blankly at the wall, a ruined, pathetic shell of the golden child he was supposed to be. Preston pushes himself slightly away from the wall, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looks at me with an expression of sheer terror, realizing that the woman he had openly mocked and belittled just days ago now holds the financial power to completely annihilate him. He reaches out a trembling hand, perhaps to offer a desperate, useless apology, but he cannot find his voice. I turn my attention to the far end of the marble island. Resting near the espresso machine is the crumpled, slightly torn $100 bill Preston had violently thrown at me during our miserable dinner at the steakhouse. He had tossed it at me like a beggar, demanding I pay for the privilege of their company. I reach out and pick up the crisp currency. I smooth it out deliberately between my fingers. I walk around the edge of the island and approach Preston. He shrinks back against the wall, his eyes wide and fearful. I stop right in front of him. I reach out and smoothly tuck the $100 bill directly into the breast pocket of his expensive ruined suit jacket. "Keep it, Preston," I say, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. "You're going to need it for gas money." I step back, taking in the complete, devastating wreckage of the Caldwell dynasty scattered across my living room. They are entirely broken, stripped of their arrogance, their wealth, and their manufactured superiority. "You all have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property," I command, my tone echoing with the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "If you are not completely off the estate grounds by noon on Wednesday, I will have the local sheriff physically remove you for trespassing." I turn my back on them, completely walking toward the large floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I do not watch them leave. I do not listen to Beatrice's continued weeping or Calvin's heavy, defeated footsteps as he slowly shuffles toward the mahogany double doors. I simply look out at the sprawling, vibrant city below, feeling a profound, incredible sense of silence finally wash over my life. The heavy, suffocating chain that had bound me to their toxic expectations has been entirely permanently severed. 48 hours later, the oppressive, humid heat of the late summer afternoon hangs heavily over the manicured lawns of the Caldwell estate. The sprawling Georgian-style mansion with its pristine white columns and sweeping circular driveway looks exactly the same as it always has. It is a monument to generational wealth and exclusive privilege. But today, the meticulously curated illusion is dead. The grand front lawn is completely covered in a chaotic, humiliating mess of cardboard moving boxes, black trash bags, and hastily packed designer luggage. The pristine image of the Caldwell family is being actively dismantled in broad daylight. I sit in the back seat of a sleek black corporate SUV as it turns off the main road and crunches slowly up the long gravel driveway. Through the tinted windows, I watch the scene unfold with quiet, analytical detachment. Calvin is standing near the front steps, his tie loosened, his face slick with sweat, aggressively shouting instructions at a pair of exhausted movers. Beatrice is sitting on a stack of expensive patio furniture, clutching a framed oil painting to her chest, openly weeping as her neighbors peer curiously from behind their perfectly trimmed hedges. Chloe is dragging a heavy rolling rack of designer coats across the brick walkway, her face contorted in a mask of furious, humiliated rage. Preston is nowhere to be seen, likely holed up in a cheap hotel room, desperately trying to avoid the federal process servers. Jamal is sitting on the curb, staring blankly at his own shoes, completely unresponsive to the chaos exploding around him. The black SUV comes to a smooth halt directly in front of the grand entryway. The driver steps out and opens my door. I step out into the humid air, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored blazer. I am not alone. I am flanked by two senior attorneys from my corporate litigation team, both carrying thick leather briefcases. Walking directly behind us is the local county sheriff, his hand resting casually on his utility belt, his face a mask of bored professional authority. Calvin stops shouting at the movers the second he sees me. He freezes, his eyes darting from my face to the uniformed officer standing over my shoulder. The last remaining shreds of his towering patriarchal ego shatter completely. He realizes this is not a negotiation. This is not a family dispute. This is a legally mandated state-enforced eviction, and it is happening in front of the entire country club neighborhood. Calvin practically sprints down the front steps, his heavy shoes slapping against the brick. He stops a few feet away from me, physically placing his body between me and the open front door of the mansion. He raises his hands in a desperate, frantic gesture of surrender. "Maya, please." Calvin begs, his voice a harsh, breathless whisper. He looks around frantically, his eyes darting toward the neighboring properties where high society wives are actively watching the spectacle unfold. "Please do not do this right now. Do not do this here. Give us until midnight. We just need a few more hours to load the trucks. Do not humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood. I am begging you." I look at the man who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was an embarrassment. I look at the man who had actively sabotaged my career, disowned me for choosing to be a teacher, and mortgaged my mother's ancestral home to fund a criminal enterprise. He is not begging for his family's safety. He is begging to preserve his own shallow, fragile public image. I do not raise my voice. I do not show an ounce of anger or vindictiveness. I simply look at him with the cold, assessing gaze of an educator grading a fundamentally flawed exam. I'm just a lowly teacher, Dad. I say, my voice perfectly clear, ensuring the words carry over the sound of the idling SUV. I'm just giving out a lesson on consequences. Failures don't belong here. I step smoothly around him, gesturing for the sheriff to proceed. Calvin's shoulders slump completely. He does not try to stop the officer as he marches up the steps to officially serve the final eviction notice to Beatrice. I stand on the driveway watching as the Caldwell family is systematically legally removed from the property they had used to define their superiority. They are forced into their packed, waiting vehicles, driving away from the estate with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and the crushing weight of their own catastrophic choices. 6 months later, the air inside the newly renovated community center smells brightly of fresh paint and ozone. The massive open concept space located right in the heart of the inner city school district where I spent 10 years teaching is entirely transformed. The walls are lined with high-end digital workstations, interactive smartboards, and collaborative coding pods. The room is filled with the energetic, joyful noise of 50 high school students actively designing their own software applications, their faces illuminated by the glow of the monitors. I stand near the back of the room, leaning casually against a structural pillar, holding a warm cup of coffee. I watch a young girl no older than 15 enthusiastically explain a complex routing algorithm to her peers. She points at the screen, her eyes wide with the sheer thrill of building something entirely her own. This state-of-the-art technology center, fully funded and endowed by my corporate holding company, is completely free for every student in the district. I take a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a profound, deep-seated warmth spread through my chest. This is what actual impact looks like. This is what genuine legacy is supposed to be. My phone buzzes softly in the pocket of my blazer. I pull it out, waking the screen. It is a text message from Chloe. It is a long, rambling block of frantic text. Preston has officially filed for bankruptcy and completely abandoned her, fleeing the state to avoid the mounting civil lawsuits. She is facing eviction from the cheap weekly rental she had been hiding in. She is begging for a loan. She is pleading for me to wire her enough money to afford a small studio apartment, promising to pay me back, promising that she has changed, swearing that family has to stick together in times of crisis. I read the message once. I do not feel a single pang of guilt. I do not feel anger or sorrow. I feel absolutely nothing at all for the woman who had happily tried to orchestrate my total financial destruction just half a year ago. I swipe left on the notification. I tap the screen once. I delete the text message entirely, wiping it from my phone and my life without a second thought. I slide the phone back into my pocket. I look out over the vibrant, bustling room full of bright, ambitious students. I realize with absolute, unshakable clarity that true wealth was never about the mahogany dining tables, the designer clothes, or the sprawling ancestral estates. True wealth was never about hoarding capital to bludgeon other people into submission. True wealth is simply the absolute, uncompromising freedom to walk away from toxic people and build a table entirely of your own. I smile, taking one last look at the deleted notification screen in my mind. I turn my phone completely off, push myself away from the pillar, and walk back into the bright, noisy room to help my students build their future. The most profound lesson from Maya's journey is that true empowerment comes from self-reliance and the courage to define your own worth. When you are surrounded by toxic environments that seek to diminish your value, your greatest weapon is your silent, persistent dedication to your own personal growth. Vengeance is rarely found in screaming matches or petty arguments. It is achieved by building an unassailable foundation of success that your detractors can never touch. True wealth is not measured by the status symbols you inherit, but by the absolute freedom to walk away from those who seek to destroy you. If you found Maya's journey inspiring, hit the like button, subscribe for more empowering stories, and share your own experiences with setting boundaries in the comments section.